A hearty welcome to you to Wits University. And without further ado, I'd like to invite Deputy Vice Chancellor in charge of research and postgraduate affairs at this university, Professor Zebron Lagasi, to give us his thoughts at this very beginning of the program.
Thank you, Foreign Director. Thank you, Dr. Wabesa. First, I'd like to extend my apologies to the Vice Chancellor, Professor Habib, who also presented, on his behalf, I'm presenting this morning because of many commitments he has as he's preparing to take sabbatical. But it gives me a great pleasure to welcome you here to this West China Africa reporting project sponsored by China Daily South Africa, that is part of the China Daily South Africa series of 2018. And first I mentioned, I'd like to welcome His Excellency Ambassador Dr. Manilisi Genge, the Chief Director of East Asia and Oceania, the Department of International Relations and Cooperations of the Republic of South Africa. I don't think he has arrived yet, but I will, of course, welcome him. And also I'd like to welcome you all, distinguished ladies and gentlemen, Wits, members of the university community, visitors, guests, and members of the diplomatic and press corps. I welcome you to Wits. It gives me a great pleasure just to say a few words about my reflections from the point of view of the university management and the position that Wits places in regard as a university to China. It's been 20 years since there was the official SA Middle Kingdom diplomatic ties, but those ties, of course, extend beyond those years in the history prior to the democratic dispensation. Many liberation movements have had a very close relationship with the People's Republic of China from the 60s onwards. So it's a relationship that has its seedlings much earlier, prior to the actual formal diplomatic relations, and forged in the furnace of jointly working together as part of the non-aligned movement, and so on and so forth, in ensuring that the world is a much better place and an equitable world that is multipolar and takes into account all countries, irrespective of their diplomatic and military and political and economic muscle. So I think China has been indeed a great partner for the African continent. Within the South African context, within the location of Wits, as will be discussed in a short while by Ms. Melanie Yep, that there is a long history of China-South Africa cultural exchange, starting even with the mining community here, and so on and so forth. So even the roots of the Chinese community in South Africa are deeper than the last 20 years. So we are talking about here an emphasis of a relationship between the two respective countries that predates the last 20 years. From the university point of view, last year the Vice Chancellor embarked on a visit to the People's Republic of China, and shall I say, also including, if I could say, Greater China, with Hong Kong. Several universities were visited there. It was organized through the office of the Deputy Vice Chancellor, headed by the Director for International Relations in our office, Dr. Muller, who accompanied the Vice Chancellor and some members of the West Senior Delegation Professorate to China. A year before that, I was also in China as well, and at the launch of the BRICS University League meeting at the Beijing National University. And I visited the several Beijing-based universities. I met the Vice President for Internationalization at Peking University. I went to Tsinghua University. I visited the Beijing University for Media Studies and the School for Languages in China as well. So with these examples, I've given you a very short illustration of the already strong cultural, social, historical, and of course, intellectual ties. I do believe that the exchange of intellectual information provides the mortar that glues all these bricks together. So these bricks will not glue together if there's no intellectual cultural exchange. And that can only be facilitated through the intellectual, cultural, social, and academic exchange. So Wits sees itself as playing a very pivotal role as an interlocutor of dialogues, as is exemplified by what we're saying this morning, to ensure that we have these exchanges, and of course critique in a very constructive way as to how we can make this relationship grow from strength to strength, and even peer back into the past. And even from our history, it's been shown that this relationship goes to the period around the 1400s, when Admiral Zhang sent his fleet to East Africa. I'm not a historian, I'm a physicist, and if I get it wrong, I beg your pardon. But that's what I've understood, that there was an expedition around East Africa, and it's been captured by all archaeological findings of the first Sino-African relationship that goes beyond even Bartholomew Diaz's arrival in Cape Delgoa. So with those few words, I'd like to once again congratulate all the organizers who have organized what looks like a very exciting program, which I unfortunately, owing to my burden of office, I'll not be able to attend, but I wish I could have, because I've got a firm interest in this relationship. But I'll not be here for long, and I'd have to shortly depart for another meeting, but I wish you well, and again, thank you very much, and have a very fruitful conversation. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, Prof. Lakazi. Now that we do not yet have the presence of Ambassador Dr. Genge from Department of International Relations, I would like to vary the program a bit, and therefore invite my long-time colleague, Yushan, to come over and start us off. And then we shall actually then go back to Dr. Genge, Dr. Ambassador Genge, once he arrives. And Yushan is a very experienced and vast scholar in this field of Africa-China, focusing particularly on matters, journalism and media, interactions at the cultural level. She worked with the SABC, obtained her master's degree at this very important university before defecting to UP, where she's now doing her PhD. She's been associated with SIRE and is also a research associate with the Africa-China Reporting Project. So let's put our hands together and welcome Yushan.
Good morning, everyone, and thank you to the organizers for providing me the space to speak to you today. So just to outline, I suppose, I think I'm supposed to be speaking under the panel of trends and historical perspectives. So what I thought today was really take a trends focus, because I think we will be hearing more about the history later on. And just, regarding my relationship with the topic, I think like a lot of the panelists today and some of the attendees, I am a South African Chinese. I grew up in Johannesburg, and as Bob mentioned, I also happen to study at Wits. But so that won't be the basis of this discussion that I'll be focusing on today, but rather, I suppose, my role as from a researcher perspective, including some of the work that I did do previously at the South African Institute of International Affairs regarding emerging country engagement in Africa in the field of international relations. And so my input really today is, I suppose, the result of kind of the information that has been accumulated and some of the consultations we did had undertaken on the China-South Africa relationship since about 2010, which then resulted in some co-authored publications in 2014 and 2016. So I suppose my contribution then, and maybe it's at a good point in this event, is really to not necessarily address the audience as a practitioner. I don't specifically contribute to the relationship like some of the other panelists do, but I kind of wanted to set the scene and provide some of my observations on the relationship through the research, and hopefully this can lead and inform some of the discussions later today. So then drawing on the previous work, I suppose there are three broad observations, or what I would see as kind of the conclusions I could draw about the relationship. And number one, and I'm sure some of you might have heard this quite a bit, is really what makes the South Africa-China relationship unique? What are the unique attributes? And what makes this relationship kind of different from China's relationship with the rest of the continent? And I think contrary to a lot of views that look at China mainly engaging in Africa in terms of resources, although South Africa is rich in resources, it is also a relatively diversified and mature economy. It has strong institutional structures, if we look at banking and infrastructure. And at the same time, I think what makes South Africa also unique is really it's home to such a vibrant civil society. And one Chinese academic also happened to note, and I think it's useful, that South Africa is also unique in that it happens to be one of the biggest number of destinations, one of the biggest number of Chinese cultural activities, students, tourists, Confucius institutes that promote Chinese language and culture, as well as sister cities. It also happens to be home to the largest Chinese community, consisting of generations of Chinese families. And at the same time, I think if we look at the global multilateral level, there's also, I think a different kind of relationship there, where South Africa and China share a lot of similar platforms. So if we look at the United Nations, and I have heard from South African diplomats before that I think they recognize that despite the fact that China and South Africa or some other African countries sometimes differ in terms of their positions, in terms of voting, such as Libya, on the UN, what is notable is that they appreciate that China actually engages them and discusses their position before they actually formulate a formal position. Of course, we know about the Forum on China-Africa Cooperation, and South Africa hosted that in 2015. That's another platform. And South Africa and China will host the event this year, I think in September in Beijing. And of course, both countries also share the BRICS platform, where they kind of join together with other members due to their common view in terms of restructuring global governance. So then that goes to my second point, I think, and it's kind of an obvious point, but I think it's important to emphasize that we often talk about this China-South Africa relationship or China engagement in South Africa. But I think what a lot of the perspectives will kind of emphasize today is really that what exists is, I think, many China-South Africa relationships. I mean, I think it's very difficult to speak about a singular China engagement in South Africa. And I think an example of this is really the Chinese diaspora or community. This is a good example because I think, as we'll hear, is that there are different waves of migration and also various factors for, I think, Chinese presence in South Africa. And I think an important point to make is that there are varying, I think, degrees of assimilation to South Africa amongst the Chinese community, as well as varying degrees of closeness to China. I mean, often, I'm told when I speak Mandarin that people are surprised that I speak with such a South African accent. So I think there are those different varying degrees of closeness. And also, often, sometimes if I get interviewed or asked the question about, so what are South African perceptions towards China? I think that in itself is not a singular story. So, for example, often, I think it depends on the position someone is in within South African society, as well as their background. And I think if you think of like diplomats or business people who have in fact engaged China for a longer period of time, they tend to provide a much more nuanced or deeper perspective in terms of, I think, China's engagement and also understanding of China as a society. Whereas I think if you think of someone who loses economically from the relationship, for example, through the trade with China. So I think this is an important gap in inquiry then to think about, is really to ask, why do people think the way they do about the relationship? And of course, I think today we'll hear about the diplomatic relationship, the economic relationship, and the Chinese community. And I think these are all interrelated, of course. But I also think they demonstrate, I think, the different facets of the relationship. So then that leads to, I guess, the third area, which I think is important, is that we often look at this relationship as something defined and static. But I think it's constantly changing. And I think it constantly evolves. And this is due to various factors. And I think one example that I can point out to is if we look at the change in different presidencies and approaches to China since democratic South Africa in 1994. So for example, if we look at South Africa under Nelson Mandela, this is when we really saw the change of recognition from Taiwan to the People's Republic of China taking place around 1997-98. And this occurred around the same time that Hong Kong was returned to China under British rule. And then if we go on to under President Mbeki, where relations were largely cordial, I think it was cordial, and this is also when the FOCAC, the China-Africa Forum, was established in 2000. But at the same time, I think his main focus at the time was really to articulate in South Africa as well as the continent's interests under the African Renaissance, which saw also an emphasis of strengthening relations with traditional partners such as the G8. And at this point, you also saw certain, I think, there was also disagreement between China and South Africa surrounding issues around, for example, Sudan and Zimbabwe in the 2000s. And this was because South Africa itself was facing complicated relations with these countries, while you saw China moving closer. However, I think more recently you see a much more agreeable position where I think both sides recognize the need to engage these parties and not necessarily isolate them. Then we move on to under President Zuma, and I think what's interesting about this relationship is really it took place in the aftermath of the 2008 financial crisis. And I think a few policy makers have even noted that the South Africa's economic relationship with China was really what helped South Africa weather the storm after the financial crisis. And this is also when China eventually became South Africa's biggest trading partner. Of course, it's also when we saw the comprehensive strategic partnership be signed in 2010, South Africa then joining the BRICS, and of course I mentioned South Africa eventually hosting the FOCAC in 2015. And on the sidelines of this, we saw a lot of agreements and MOUs being signed between China and South Africa. And interesting, one of them was with regards to the Belt and Road Initiative, which is really I think the cross-regional integration drive that China proposed in 2013, where both sides committed to collaborating on the initiative. So I think a bigger question then that I've asked about this change or evolution in the relationship is really, is this relationship then due to specific leaders and individuals, or is it really a culmination of events since 1994 and previously that leads to the relationship that we see today? So I think one thing that emanates from the South African side as well is, I think since 2009 and Zuma, you saw South Africa's own orientation of foreign policy and rhetoric lean more towards development pragmatism and a collectivist Southern orientation, so focusing more on the African perspective. So I think, of course, with the next FOCAC coming up, and I mean everyone's asking questions about what will the approach be under Ramaphosa, and I think no one can really predict that. But I think one interesting point that I would make is that as deputy president, he was already engaging in the relationship. I mean, I remember he was part of the discussions leading up to the previous FOCAC, as well as deputy president, because South Africa and China have the binational commission where both sides meet on a regular basis. He, as deputy president, was, for example, meeting with his Chinese counterpart, and I think as recent as late last year. So then I think the question is, and I think important to emphasize, is the impacts on the trajectory of this relationship is not singular. And I think there are various factors that I mentioned that could impact the relationship. And one thing that often I think we forget is that as much as we talk about a China engagement in South Africa, I think there is equally a South Africa reaching out towards China. And for example, when we spoke to some South African stakeholders like trade unions and I think the mining sector, I think there's increasing awareness of the cost and benefits of engaging China as a partner and a market. But I think because of the way that South Africa's economy is structured, I mean, at the end of the day, we also want to sell our products externally. So I think it also comes to a point where the biggest challenge is how do you address this the trade imbalance between South Africa and China, where South Africa is exporting more natural resources. And of course, we have to consider the regional dynamics. I think, does South Africa necessarily understand well how China is engaging its own neighbors as well as the continent, and what kind of agreements they're signing as well? We know of late China is engaging East Africa a lot more in terms of manufacturing, building of ports and railway. And the question is, could this in turn impact the bilateral relationship and South Africa's role on the continent? And I suppose the same can be said about other Asian players now engaging Africa. I heard there's a possibility of, for example, Indonesia-Africa summit as well. And we see South Korea as well as Japan engaging increasingly as well as India. And then again, I think another factor that I think that needs to be emphasized is really that the relationship is also subject to the domestic dynamics within South Africa. I remember, I think in 2016, we saw the news development of, for example, Chinese fishing trawlers off the coast of South Africa. And I think what was interesting is if you look at the online commentary from South Africans, of course there was the question and debate about whether their presence was even legal. But I think another interesting aspect for me was really, you start to see a discussion from South Africans about, can South Africa and the government and the Navy actually protect our own national waters? So often you start to see a debate, and I think the dynamic between South Africa itself, and I think that's quite interesting. So I think the implication then from this example really for, I think, the diplomatic relationship is really, I think diplomats and policymakers recognize that there needs to be more effort in terms of communicating about this bilateral relationship. Because I think sometimes there is a gap between the elite articulation of foreign policy as well as the reality of the domestic level, where we see party politics or internal party politics playing out. And another question then is, can South Africa and China reconcile kind of this disjuncture between the official policy based on common interests, while public perceptions seem to emphasize differences. And I think that's what was mentioned previously, I think where universities and people engagement come in. So I think I'll kind of leave it there, and because as I mentioned, I'm kind of trying to seek out and kind of point out the context of the relationship, and really just point to some thinking points, for example, about the unique aspects or maybe not unique aspects about the relationship, the fact that there are several relationships taking place at the same time, and really that we have to consider that this relationship is not static. So thank you very much.
Thanks, Yusha, for setting the pace. I think you've, in those couple of minutes, kind of summarized and rounded up, in a very nice way, the very current dynamics in the relations. I will now invite Melanie Yap, who is a long-time Sino-Africa analyst. She actually wrote the book, which many of us have actually read, called Color, Confusion and Concessions, the history of the Chinese in South Africa. She comes from a journalistic background, having been sub-editor, reader, editor, and all that. I recommend very highly that the book, Color, Confusion and Concessions, is a must read for anybody who really wants to tap into Chinese interests, Chinese dynamics, all the way back from the 17th century to the present. And then, so Melanie, welcome, and let's hear from you. And then we will definitely hope that as you listen, you are making notes or picking out points that you will tease out during the question and answer sessions. Thank you and welcome.
Thank you. Sorry. Thank you very much for that kind introduction. Sorry, I'm not used to all this high-tech stuff, and I'm not sure where I should be looking. Thank you very much. I think, first of all, I need to point out the fact that you're looking at something rather historical. The book that we're referring to is Color, Confusion and Concessions, The History of the Chinese in South Africa. It was published 21 years ago, so it's an historical artifact in itself. But the reason it's still pertinent now is just to give you some kind of historical perspective on who the Chinese are, where they came from, and their position in South Africa as such. So hopefully from that perspective, the fact that the book is 21 years old doesn't date the information it has. Because of the scope of the subject, I clearly cannot go into too much detail. This is going to be a short 15-minute presentation. So I want to take you very quickly just through an overview of who the Chinese are and how they originated. And possibly the best way to approach this is to look at it in terms of Chinese migration to the country over the centuries. So if I can just get this to start working. So we're going to be looking from the 1650s up to the present. The story of the Chinese in South Africa begins in the Cape in the 1650s, after the Dutch established a refreshment station for ships traveling to and from the East Indies. The first Chinese arrived as exiles and convicts. Some were political prisoners exiled from Batavia to serve out their sentence in the Cape. They only numbered at most 100 men by 1795 and were part of the free blacks in the Cape. They worked as basket makers, fishermen, traders and craftsmen, marrying local women and becoming part of the cosmopolitan Cape. Scattered records exist of Chinese living and dying in the Cape in the 19th century. Early gravestones from the 1850s onwards may well include those of Chinese laborers and artisans imported into the Cape and Natal for sundry projects. Small batches of laborers were brought into the country during the 19th century to work on the Durban harbour in Natal, as well as a railway and racecourse in Cradock. The forefathers of the Chinese, who are now 4th and 5th generation South Africans, arrived as independent immigrants from the 1870s onwards. They originated from the Guangzhou and Meishan areas in the southern Chinese province of Guangdong, near Hong Kong, making their way to sea via Mauritius. Making their way by sea via Mauritius. Many came in the hope of digging for gold and diamonds, but soon found they had to earn a living as traders, laundrymen, workers, and market gardeners. Through the process of chain migration, where immigrants assisted relatives or clansmen, the numbers of Chinese gradually increased in all major towns throughout the country, particularly in the Eastern Cape, Cape Town, Durban, as well as Johannesburg and Pretoria. The most significant and researched influx of Chinese into South Africa took place between 1904 and 1910, when the British government brought more than 63,000 indentured Chinese labourers to the Witwatersrand to revive the ailing gold mines after the Anglo-Boer War. They were imported on 3-year contracts, but their importation had a huge impact on the existing free Chinese already settled in South Africa. It also meant that a Chinese diplomatic representative was required to represent his government, and the first Chinese Consul General, Liu Yuklin, established an office in Hospital Hill in Johannesburg in 1905. Much controversy accompanied the arrival of the mine labourers. There was political outcry in Britain, and local unions too were in an uproar over adding Chinese to the existing black and white racial mix in the country. The labourers were strictly controlled and kept in compounds, which gave rise to many incidents of ill treatment and abuse. The mines used Chinese labour for unskilled, back-breaking jobs underground. This Chinese labour experiment came to an end within 6 years, when all the controversy led to the fall of the Conservative government in Britain. Measures were quickly implemented to end the importation of Chinese and to start repatriating the Chinese. By 1910, virtually all had been sent back to China. Their brief stay, however, unleashed much fear among locals in South Africa. The Cape Colony quickly enacted the first legislation specifically to prohibit Chinese entry into the Cape, the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1904. The law required all existing Chinese residents to carry this document, which they called a dog license. The law remained in force for 32 years and was significant in ensuring the numbers of Chinese in the Cape remained low. One of the very early Chinese organizations in the Cape appears to have been formed in response to the implementation of the Exclusion Act. The Cape Colony Chinese Association opposed the act to little avail. In the Transvaal, governmental restrictions on Asiatic immigration were tightened, and the Chinese worked with the Indians to oppose the Asiatic Law Amendment Act in 1907. Many joined Mahatma Gandhi's passive resistance campaign, choosing to be jailed rather than submit to the law. This table reflects the numbers imprisoned up to 1908, and it is interesting to note the disproportionately high numbers of Chinese who were imprisoned for their resistance to the law. Between 1905 and 1907, they were counted at over 1,000, close to the total Chinese population at the time. Immigration, we go on to 1913. By 1913, adult male immigration of all Asiatics was banned in South Africa, which meant the only Chinese legally permitted entry were wives and children. Young brides were sent from China, and children could be sent to China to gain some Chinese education, provided they returned before the age of 18. This table reflects the gradual increase in the numbers of Chinese in the country, bearing in mind that adult male immigration was totally prohibited. Young boys were allowed entry, and there were instances of illegal immigrants and those buying immigration papers intended for others. Chinese clubs offered settlers opportunities to mix with their countrymen, to have letters written in Chinese sent home, and to keep up to date with events. These were two of the early Chinese clubs in Johannesburg, begun prior to and during the time of passive resistance in Johannesburg. The first Chinatown in Johannesburg was a part of Ferreira's Town, to the west of the city, where Chinese clubs were established from the late 1890s, where the first Chinese school was established, and where the community gathered socially. Obtaining a good education has always been one of the driving forces within the Chinese community. When permitted, they sent their children to any schools open to them, mainly colored and Indian schools. Throughout the country, no matter how small their numbers, the Chinese tried to set up private Chinese schools if their children were not allowed into other institutions. They welcomed the opportunity to go to private Catholic and Anglican schools when these opened their doors from the 1940s and 1950s. By the 1950s, Chinese were among the non-whites permitted into the open universities of Wits and Cape Town. But then the threatened closure of these institutions to people of color drove the Chinese to join local protests. These were medical students outside the Johannesburg City Hall in the 1950s. Apartheid laws in South Africa throughout the 1950s and 1960s caused much upheaval in the Chinese community. Threatened by group areas, many feared for their livelihood and future. For opposition newspapers, however, the anomalies in the treatment of Chinese, who were neither white nor black, gave them ample ammunition to attack the nationalist government. Classified as a subgroup of the colored group, Chinese had to use the separate facilities provided for this group, including separate benches for non-whites. Life under apartheid essentially offered the Chinese three courses of action: to resist, to adjust, or to escape. The resistors were few, but they participated in the Defiance Campaign in 1952, and some aligned themselves to the African National Congress and the Communist Party. Those with the means chose to emigrate, but most had to remain and make the best of what was to come. Because of South Africa's economic ties with Japan in the 1960s, the government allowed special concessions to Japanese businessmen, treating them as honorary whites, which meant they could use facilities reserved for whites. This, of course, unleashed criticism and led to embarrassing incidents when Japanese were mistaken for Chinese and refused entry to facilities. In the following years, some petty apartheid restrictions on Chinese were lifted. By the 1970s, South Africa was increasingly isolated in the international community. Taiwan found itself in a similar position as a pariah state, and ties between the two countries grew closer. The Rand Easter Show provided a showcase for the Republic of China on Taiwan to display its products to South Africans. By the 1970s and 80s, increasing trade between the two countries led to an easing in immigration restrictions on Chinese and the influx of entrepreneurs from Taiwan, particularly into the homeland areas where they set up factories. It should be mentioned here that the Chinese Consulate General, first established in 1905, continued to function in South Africa throughout the 20th century. It was often the Chinese Consul General who assisted the local community in dealing with issues. When the People's Republic of China was established in 1948, community members found mainland China close to them. The official Chinese Consulate General and later the Chinese Embassy in South Africa, up to 1998, were representatives from the Republic of China on Taiwan. Within the South African Chinese community, sport played a major role in keeping alive a strong community spirit. Not permitted to compete in sports against those of other colors, young Chinese competed against each other. From the 1950s, the Chinese organized an interprovincial sports gathering called the Easter Tournament, hosted alternately in cities such as Johannesburg, Pretoria, Cape Town, and Port Elizabeth. And this sports event has remained a significant Chinese community gathering right up to the present. South Africa's first democratic elections in 1994 were memorable, not least for South African-born Chinese, who were finally permitted to participate in elections along with their fellow citizens of color. For 14 years into the new South Africa, race continued to be a determining factor in the lives of the Chinese, who remained suspended in that racial limbo separating whites and blacks. Chinese found themselves not black enough to qualify for the many black economic empowerment opportunities in the same way as under apartheid they were not white enough. After protracted negotiations with government, the Chinese Association of South Africa asked the High Court of Pretoria to rule on the Chinese position for the broad-based Economic Empowerment Act and the Employment Equity Act. On 18th of June 2008, a judge granted an order to include Chinese South Africans in the definition of black people. This ruling finally validated the Chinese position, affirming that they had suffered discrimination over many years, and in common with other groups who had been historically or previously disadvantaged, they therefore also qualified for opportunities offered in terms of BEE and employment equity. The only Chinese affected by the ruling were Chinese South Africans, people who had lived in South Africa under apartheid, and they numbered far fewer than 10,000 people nationally. From the 1990s, Cyrildene in Johannesburg became one of the many new Chinatowns which sprang up around South Africa to cater for the needs of the latest influx of Chinese from Hong Kong, Singapore, and China. The new arrivals came prior to and after the establishment of diplomatic relations between South Africa and the People's Republic of China in 1998. Since then, their numbers have grown, and it's been estimated that there may be as many as 250,000 Chinese in South Africa. China malls mushroomed along the Witwatersrand, and Chinese shops are now evident in virtually all towns throughout the country. The story of the Chinese in South Africa is ever-changing, and the time allocated for this talk necessitated only a very brief 15-minute overview. Most of the information comes from this book, which was published 21 years ago. It is nearly out of print, with only a few copies still available, but we hope to be able to digitize this book in the next year or so to continue to make it available. Thank you.
Thank you, Melanie. I think that is a very interesting presentation, taking us back several layers, back to the 15th century, in fact, and demonstrating that South Africa-China relations are anything but new. I mean, in literature and in media coverage, we tend to imagine that the Chinese started arriving only in the new millennium. But as we can see, the relations are actually very historical. And that works very well with Yushan's presentation, which was pretty much the current dynamics in the relations and so forth. So I would like now to invite Yushan back to the podium so that we can entertain questions from the audience. And as we do that, I would like also to recognize the arrival and presence of Ambassador Genge, head of East Asia and Pacific at DERCO. We welcome you, sir. So I wonder, first of all, before the BBC leaves, the Deputy Vice Chancellor leaves, if you have any question for him, because I can see he's nearly stepping up. Any question for him on maybe the place of Wits in this whole engagement, or now that he's a scientist, maybe matters to do with nuclear energy, which is his area of expertise. Any question for the professor?
Thank you. Just one qualifier. I can see some academics at the back and researchers. I've got no research funding.
Right. Prof is in charge of research office, and we, although he's saying there's no funding for research, some of us here will not be going to him to convince him otherwise. We hope we'll be successful. But there being no question for Prof. Vilakazi, he may live at his own pleasure. Not that we're saying he lives now. No, there's one there actually. Yeah.
Hello? Hi. I think before Professor Vilakazi leaves, I have one question about the Wits policy towards Chinese cooperation. So would you just give us some outlines about what Wits is looking at in the next few years, how Wits will, let's say, focus on the cooperation with China? Thanks.
Thank you very much. That's an excellent question. Melanie has given you, or two previous speakers have given you a historical synopsis, but other one is based on future, the current. And this historical synopsis tells you about the South Africa's position with respect to China. And that obviously has a bearing on the research and partnership trajectory that the university takes. All those relationships are influenced by the prevailing circumstances. For example, historically, South Africa, for obvious reasons, most of our research partnerships either have had an arrow pointing towards the north, largely the United States and Western Europe. In fact, in Western Europe itself, it was the United Kingdom, Germany in the natural sciences, and of course the United States. I think that has been, for many years, characterized South Africa's international strategic partnership just because of where people study and those historical patterns. Our strategic thrust over the last 5 years has focused on not abandoning our traditional relationships, which of course are very important, but to dial the arrow more towards the east and ensuring that we now have a diverse footprint of our partnerships, right? And in particular with the People's Republic and other universities in there, for the want of a better word, as I said earlier, Greater China, if that is an acceptable word. And excuse my diplomatic puns if it's not my gift of mastering that very complex space. But as you saw last year, there was a major, as I mentioned earlier, visit by the Vice Chancellor and his team, and you have our interlocutor there, which actually said that we've identified 4 or 5 key areas where South Africa can partner with China. In fact, last year myself, I was at a meeting in Beijing where we were hosted by the ambassador that facilitated the dialogue between the Department of Science and Technology and South Africa in terms of establishing some science parks akin to the Tsinghua Science Park in China. So those are the kind of experiences you can learn. And of course, Chinese universities can learn from South Africa. So it's a mutually beneficial relationship. And moreover, we are working very, very strongly towards partnerships in terms of student exchange. I think we can have bureaucrats like myself, flying in to and fro, but this will come to naught if you don't actually exchange people themselves. I think relationships, long-term partnerships are about people. Research is about people after all. It's a human enterprise. As a scientist, we try to pretend sometimes to have this cold scientific distance and subjective analysis of data. But we are humans. You bring your human attributes to your interpretation of the natural world. And so different cultures bring their own individual attributes. So by opening up this new domain, using with students and researchers at the forefront, it's early days. We hope that in the next, we should play the long game, the next 20, 30 years, we'll have almost a bridge between the two nations and the two universities, Wits and other universities, collaborating strongly with a fast emerging research powerhouse. The latest statistics I got from the Web of Science suggest that for the first time in 100 years, the Chinese have launched more patents. They have had much higher impact factors in journal publications. This suggests that the domain of knowledge production is no longer centralized around the Silicon Valley and MIT and Harvard, but Tsinghua, Peking are becoming really strong intellectual powerhouses that will add a next dimension to this global knowledge enterprise. So it's a very long professorial answer. Bureaucrats tend to talk for too long, but I thought I'd like to give you a perspective. Thank you very much.
I think just a last one for Prof. How come we do not have a Confucius Institute at Wits? We do have a Confucius Institute at UCT, UJ, UT. Maybe you can respond to that very quickly.
Difficult one, but I can give you a simple answer. We wanted something, everyone has done Confucius Institute, right? Somehow, there's kind of less exceptionalism. We cannot be me too. We wanted something deeper than that we don't have. Center for Chinese Studies in Africa. We actually are working very closely, as you know, with our Chinese counterparts to establish a Center for Chinese Studies. So it complements the already existing Confucius Institute, because therefore if we become another Confucius Institute, we're not adding anything new. We need to now take this next dimension, which is now, like we have the Center for Indian Studies in South Africa, now we're moving towards establishing an equivalent of a Center for Chinese Studies that will influence policy in a much more strategic and much more intellectually nuanced way of engaging across all domains of exchange between us. So I do believe that the Center for Chinese Studies will be much more profound in the way of enhancing those.
There's one last one.
Yeah, a last one.
Yeah, sure.
Okay. With the launch of the Belt and Road Initiative, China has also launched a Belt and Road University Alliances. I don't know whether you're aware of it. And I've also noticed from this alliance, we've seen more cooperation between China and the European institutions than China and African institutions. So I wonder from your perspective how Wits can actually push forward Africa's participation into this alliance.
Wonderful, thank you. Yes, I've heard of it. The Wits as a partner with the rest of Africa, your question is not just about Wits, but Wits' role in relation to ensuring a broader African participation, right? I mean, we all know that only 1% of global knowledge is produced by the whole of the South of Africa, right? And 60% of that comes from South Africa. So there is a huge knowledge production asymmetry. And South Africa not do it alone. South Africa, Wits and the Rivers of Cape Town have established what is called an Alliance of Research Universities Africa, ARUA, and I'll be going to Ethiopia next week, which involves 16 or 17 research-intensive universities on the African continent, a kind of what I call the Ivy League, but top universities, Ibadan, IFM, Makerere, and so on and so forth, to partner with Wits, UCT, Stellenbosch, Pretoria, and other universities to form this alliance, because together we can actually now engage with Chinese universities. What are the biggest problems that we can tackle as South African and as Africans? And I think Aruba will be the sort of an equivalent of a European China or South Africa China engagement in the knowledge production sphere. We will look at various global issues that affect both Africa and China, because climate change is a global issue. We cannot locate it, right? And it's going to bear on all countries involved in the world. So I think, to me, with this alliance, we shall be able to now elevate the South Africa-China educational or intellectual exchange or cultural exchange to a broader Pan-African launchpad. Okay.
Thank you. The prof is literally sitting on the edge of the seat. We'll let him go to other pressured demands of his time and open up the session. Thank you very much, Prof. Maybe we give
Yes, yeah.
Thank you. Okay, so now we'll open up the discussion to the presentations that were made earlier, and we shall start right there. I think what you do is you introduce yourself and the institution you come from, or if you don't have an institution that you come from, you just say your name and your interest perhaps, then straight to the question, make it brief, summarize it, to the point, and indicate to whom the question should be answered by our presenters here. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Nathan. I'm an honor student in architecture at Wits University. My question is directed to Melanie. The question is, what's the role and perception of Surudin as a Chinatown in context of Johannesburg? The role and perception of Surudin Chinatown as a Chinatown in context of Johannesburg.
I'm not quite sure how to answer that question when you say in the context of Johannesburg. The kind of perspective I was offering was kind of almost from within the small existing Chinese community. So when you're talking about Surudin, it's a new feature. It's something that's sprung up in the past 15 years. So it's almost like a little transplanted bit of China in South Africa. And I think for many, from the perspective of the South African Chinese, many of us grew up with English and Afrikaans and Zulu as our mother tongues. Obviously people learn to speak some Chinese at home, but otherwise we find ourselves probably just as displaced as foreigners going into shops trying to think, how do you ask questions to buy food and the rest. Does that answer part of your question?
It addresses it a bit. And then I also have a second question. It's also, so considering the general perception of China from many, like the public domain, like what's the perception of China?
Whose perception of China?
I think Yushan can answer that question. Is the researcher and scholar on matters perceptions. Yushan.
Okay, I'll try to answer that question. I think I tried to emphasize earlier that I think the perceptions are very much, there is no one perception. I think that's what I tried to emphasize earlier. I think, I mentioned it really depends on where you fit kind of in the relationship. So for example, I said, if you're kind of losing from the relationship economically, your perception might be different from someone who's gaining from the economic relationship. It also depends the extent, I guess, of your engagement with China. So the longer you engage China, the more nuanced understanding you have, right? And I think that's one area I think where China, there's a challenge, I think, for the relationship is really, do we understand each other beyond, the traditional aspects like calligraphy or history or, I don't know, kung fu, do we understand that actually there are also a lot of similarities in terms of inequality, or that, each side has modern aspects and complexities as well as, I think, rural poverty and I think those challenges. So I think It's also, I think, those areas of like deeper understanding of each other that is possibly missing. So I think, yeah, the perceptions are quite broad and varied, and as I mentioned, it also changes over time.
All right. I think let's do now, proceed in the following manner. Let's raise up our hands if we have any questions, so that we see how many people have queries, interventions, comments. I can see one there, so you'll do one. Anybody else? We want to figure out how many people have questions. It looks like the presentations were, to the point, very convincing, very persuasive, so we only have one question. There's a second one there, from Prof there. Okay, so 2 questions. Any other questions? Because then after this we'll break for coffee until then come back for the second round of presentations. So there are 2 questions. Proceed. Name, quick introduction and question.
Yeah, my name is Shen Fei. I'm a geologist working in the mining industry of South Africa for 25 years actually. And we have seen the changes happening in South Africa in the past 20, 30 years or so. These 2 presentations give a very nice picture about the Chinese community, the culture, the relationship between the 2 countries. Well done, thank you. My question is that, say you, to some extent, you have probably the most knowledge, and especially with the young generation, you have done some research about the relationship between the 2 countries. Are you, number one, are you engaging with the South Africa Island region or governmental authorities or agents in the process to analyze, understand the issues that could hamper the relationship between the 2 countries? And then, are you going to give some kind of input to the authorities or the region in a way to improve the relationship, to improve the understanding? Because the last instant we encountered, they say, not Sunday Times published an article about possible Chinese involvement with the so-called Zuma crop, that kind of thing. Then in the end, I think the people found there was a lot of either mistake or error or whatever. So on the one side, you try to bring the truth to the service. On the other side, if you don't have the real reliable information, and then you create more damage than reveal the truth. So my question is, from your side, you are the specialists, you are the authorities in this area. Have you identified the area of risk that could hamper the relationship? Then, are you in the position, or are you doing something to help the people here, especially the media and the governmental agent, to improve that kind of relationship? So,
thank you. I think the presenters have noted the pros and cons and the solutions to some of the problem areas in the engagements. Prof?
Thanks very much, Mr. Chairman. Garth Shelton, International Relations Department at Wits University. One question for each of the speakers. Thank you very much for both of the speakers working hard to share their knowledge with us. To Melanie, you mentioned 250,000 Chinese in South Africa. About 10 years ago, I understand the figure was 300,000. So are you suggesting that Chinese are leaving South Africa or have left South Africa? And then to Yushan, we've been chair of the FOCAC process, South Africa. Have you done any research on FOCAC projects in South Africa? What's happening in terms of South Africa and the FOCAC situation? We're very interested to hear your input on that. Thank you.
That's a very professorial, number of questions. I think you can launch into them straight away. Kind of summarize. Yeah, sure.
Just quickly, I did want to add to my previous answer about the perceptions on China, because I think there are increasingly more and more surveys done about African perceptions towards China. And it's an interesting, but also in some ways concerning point about, I think, more and more African perceptions reflect that there is indeed more positive view on China, specifically in terms of its economic engagement. So the fact that it's helping build infrastructure, etc. So in that sense, it's you see possibly a more positive view towards China compared to other regions in the world. But at the same time, you kind of have to qualify that by saying, even though that is the case, is it enough to have a popular perception or image through only the economic lens? Because I think what we've noticed is really on the social aspects and the deep understanding of each other, that's really probably where it's still, there's still a missing link. And on, I suppose, the question about how I could contribute to the relationship, if I understand correctly, I think, well, first of all, I suppose I'm a researcher / academic, so I think in itself, I think specifically research from the continent in South Africa on the relationship is important. So I would hope that my contribution is purely just from actually doing work on this topic. I think our role as researchers and academics is really not to necessarily guide or help choose decisions, but possibly help point to the complexities of issues, to better understand issues, for policymakers to make those decisions. Of course, there are, I think, spaces to interact where you go to like think tank forums, etc. But I think it also leads to a bigger question about, I suppose, South African research organizations or African research organizations and their ability to influence or engage with policymakers. So I think there's that dynamic as well. But definitely, most of the work that I have done is publicly available. So I hope that in itself is an input. And I think on Professor's point about the FOCAC, I think even as researchers, another challenge is also, the access to data and information. Purely because we're talking about diplomacy and diplomatic relations. And again, I think that's one area where there's a challenge is, and diplomats note this, is really to promote the relationship. And sometimes just something not being available can be perceived as not transparent, right? So I think that's the one thing. But in terms of South Africa as chair of FOCAC, and the projects in South Africa, as I mentioned, I think South Africa is in a slightly different position where I think it is a mature, diversified economy, and I suppose China is not as involved in infrastructure type projects in South Africa, whereas China might invest, I guess, stakes in South African companies, or they might engage in the continent together, for example. But I think one thing I would point out about the FOCAC projects is that as a researcher, it's quite difficult to differentiate between what is a bilateral engagement and what is then a FOCAC, China-Africa engagement, and whether the two are necessarily the same. The same as the Belt and Road Initiative projects or engagements and a FOCAC project. So I think the difficulty there is first to kind of determine what constitutes under what project. And I've heard the comment that sometimes it depends on where the funding or what platform the funding comes from. So I think it's really to probably start from that point before we kind of know what projects belong under FOCAC or the bilateral agreement or under the Belt and Road, for example.
Thank you. Melanie?
Okay. As far as the numbers are concerned, Professor, I must confess I haven't done any original research, and I think as far as the population of the Chinese in the country is concerned, there are as many guesses as there are people. So often various figures have been bandied around, and at one stage there was in fact a depletion in the numbers of Chinese. I believe sort of around 2008, 2009, many Chinese did in fact leave. But I must admit the figure that was quoted, 250,000, is really from current newspaper reports and not backed by any research. So I'm quoting my colleagues in the media.
Okay, thank you very much for listening in. I'd like just to round up by pointing out perhaps two or three things very quickly. One is that we are here because in January 1998, South Africa and China ended formal diplomatic relations, just so that we have that background in mind. Two, in terms of Yushan's presentation, one of the points she mentioned is that we are going to witness a new dispensation in the relations under President Ramaphosa, perhaps, or perhaps not. There might be areas of continuation and areas where things change. But I think one of the events that we look forward to is the BRICS Summit, which happens in July, somewhere in South Africa, I'm sure, perhaps Durban again, or again, Durban. And I think it will be a very good indicator of where the relations are going. To our colleague who asked about what researchers can do to enhance the relation, you know, one of the things that researchers, particularly African researchers, South African researchers for that, is that we are inclined towards a Western approach to research, which is that we do research and publish our findings, rather than say, look, we are going out there to actually offer solutions, unless we are policy researchers. You know, the kind of research that happens in DIRCO, for example. For researchers from the academic end, we kind of do, you know, find what the relations are like, you know, factors, figures, and so forth, and present it to the public. Then governments actually should pick up from there. I think with regards to Prof's question about the FOCAC project, one of the intriguing you know, findings from our digging as researchers is that during FOCAC and other events, we see lots of you know, bilateral and multilateral you know, agreements and deals signed. So I think a good starting point is to go back to look at the deals, the agreements that have been signed, and see if they have been implemented or not. Oftentimes, you find that lots of what has been signed might not have been implemented. And that's perhaps an area that perhaps, you know, Ambassador Dr. Genge will perhaps respond to at some point. With those few remarks, I'd like to invite us to tea and a coffee, and then we'll go to the second very exciting session with even more practical, you know, hands-on presentations. Thank you, and let's put our hands together. All for making back to the auditorium in time. We want to launch into the second and final half of the dialogue. I think so far so good. Having discussed matters, dynamics, historical, recent history, and ancient or even past history, we now want to launch into matters economic, and matters culture, and people-to-people engagement. But before we have a discussion or presentations from our lead presenters on matters economic and culture, we would like to step back a bit and invite His Excellency Ambassador Dr. Mandelisi Genge, Chief Director of the East Asia and ASEAN Department at Department of International Relations, otherwise known simply as DECO. The Ambassador couldn't make it in good time, courtesy of challenges while he's making his way. But we are glad that he's here. Your Excellency, welcome, and let's give him a round of applause.
Thank you, Program Director, Dr. Rekasa. And of course, let me also do apologize. The traffic was a nightmare from Pretoria to Johannesburg. I do really apologize for a delay. Of course, I must acknowledge in his absence, Professor Vilakazi, who I walked in when he was here. I was glad to hear his remarks. Ladies and gentlemen, allow me, Program Director, to thank the West Department of Journalism for the invitation and for the opportunity to make the remarks on 20 years of South Africa-China diplomatic relations. On the bilateral and economic front, I would say that South Africa and China have reached a historic milestone as the two countries celebrate 20 years of the establishment of diplomatic relations. This began, of course, I heard earlier on that you were aware that it started in 1998, just 4 years after the first democratic elections in our country, which of course ushered in a new democratic dispensation under the leadership of President Nelson Mandela. South Africa has declared the year 2018 as the year of Nelson Mandela's centenary, as it marks 100 years since his birth on the 18th of July this year. The centenary year of Nelson Mandela coincides with the 20-year anniversary of the establishment of diplomatic relations between South Africa and China, Hence, the two countries plan to commemorate the centenary year of Nelson Mandela. Former President Mandela laid a solid foundation on the establishment of the South Africa-China diplomatic relations. And of course, the program director, let me assist the Deputy Vice Chancellor. He said he does not know what to call this China. The official name of China is People's Republic of China. That is in the diplomatic circle we call it by its proper name. It's People's Republic of China. Celebration will be significant, not because of the number of years we have had diplomatic relations, but due to the great achievements we can take pride during this time. Arrangements are in motion to stage appropriate events both in South Africa and in China to celebrate this milestone. All the activities scheduled for 2018 in South Africa and China will be jointly hosted under the umbrella of the celebration of the 20th anniversary of diplomatic relations. Since the first day of the year in 1998, the two countries never looked back. The relations have grown ever so strong and friendship has deepened. Now, 20 years later, we can afford to look back and appreciate our collective efforts in making South Africa-China partnership one of the most vibrant partnerships. Certainly, one of the most important partnerships for South Africa. It is no coincidence that in 2010, just 12 years after the establishment of diplomatic relations, our partnership assumed the level of a comprehensive strategic partnership. In the diplomatic cycles, the program director, that label is only existing in our own diplomatic sphere, only existing between China and South Africa. You'll realize as I go on why we have that special relationship between the two countries. South Africa and China continue to make strides in political, economical, and cultural relations. In the past 20 years, a lot of progress has been registered in all these areas, and that serves as an inspiration to continue in the same vein in the next 20 years and beyond. Our trade relations have soared, resulting in China being South Africa's #1 trading partner, and South Africa being China's top trading partner in Africa. The volume of bilateral trade between the two countries has increased year on year from 294 billion rands in 2015 to 300 billion rands in 2016. The total trade statistics for 2017 is 319 billion rands and indicates a trade deficit for South Africa of 87 billion rands. Since August 2017, South Africa became the first African country to export beef to China, a positive development which we are delighted about and which indicates progress with regard to the opening of markets for each other's products. The Chinese government offers 30 scholarships per year to South African students, according to a signed agreement on higher education cooperation. The scholarship includes tuition, accommodation, health insurance, and a monthly stipend. There are currently almost 100 South African students on this scholarship in China. Priority fields and levels of study and selection criteria determined by the South African Department of Higher Education and Training. I must say, Program Director, in most cases, I'm glad to say that we were in the academic setting. In most cases, we don't fill up the quotas or the space were offered by our partner, China. I think this is something that probably we can popularize within Wits, that they should look for opportunities as students to further their education in China. South Africa and China's structural bilateral mechanisms. This is a government lingo, let me explain it. When we talk about structured bilateral mechanisms, we refer to mechanisms that are decided that they must take place at certain times, where our leaders, be ministers, be president, be deputy president, be deputy minister, be senior officials, occur. South Africa and China structure bilateral mechanism, including the binational commission, which is chaired at the deputy president level on the South African side and the vice president on the Chinese side. The joint working group is a ministerial mechanism. And the strategic dialogue and the people-to-people exchange mechanisms have served us well and have provided us with an opportunity to exchange ideas, adopt best practices, and deepen the cooperation in research of a better future for our people. I was glad when the Vice Chancellor mentioned that whatever we do, it must have impact on the people. When our government and its Chinese partner established the people-to-people exchange mechanisms, we had exactly that these relations, as we manage as officials, let them have impact in the lives of the people, and let people get an opportunity to know each other. And the culture and education are the best of those avenues. The Binational Commission is an umbrella of South Africa's bilateral agreements with China. Whilst the Binational Commission is convened biannually, the sectoral committees covering a range of issues such as science and technology, energy, mining, among others, ensure that there is constant review and assessment of the various agreements under the Binational Commission. On the 23rd of November 2016, South Africa successfully hosted the 6th Binational Commission at the level of the Deputy President. The Binational Commission remains a crucial mechanism with the ability to oversee and direct the South Africa-China bilateral relations in line with the precepts of our comprehensive strategic partnership agreement. During the 6th Binational Commission that I referred to, South Africa and China agreed on the establishment of the Oceans Economic Sectoral Committee. As you know, that our government has recently, when I say recently, in the last few years, identified ocean economy, or sometimes called blue economy, is another frontier of exploring our economic fortunes. The two countries signed two agreements, namely the Memorandum of Understanding between the Department of Trade and Industry and the Ministry of Commerce on the Chinese side, regarding cooperation on special economic zones, industrial parks, and framework agreement between the National Development and Reform Commission of the People's Republic of China and the Department of Trade and Industry on our side for developing cooperation in production capacity. Through the BNC, that the Binational Commission, South Africa managed to advance the country's key national priorities, which are informed by the National Development Plan. The Binational Commission also afforded these two sides an opportunity to reaffirm their commitment to working together in pursuance of eradicating poverty, creating decent employment, and eliminating inequality. Of course, the People's Republic of China will host the next Binational Commission this year, or next year. It will depend on their program, but it's due this year. Then the strategic dialogue that I referred to forms part of South Africa-China Bilateral Commission and reports to the Foreign or International Relations Sectoral Committee, providing the overall political framework for the implementation of the Beijing Declaration on the establishment of the comprehensive strategic partnership. The strategic dialogue remains a highly important structured mechanism for South Africa and China to engage on matters of mutual interest and affords the two countries an excellent opportunity to prepare for the joint working group and the Binational Commission. The two countries discuss and share their positions within multilateral, regional, and global platforms. And you realize since we have established relations with China, whether we talk in terms of strictly bilateral relations or in terms of the BRICS, there's more coordination now of our international positions. with our partners. On the 22nd of last year, our Deputy Minister hosted the South African Strategic Dialogue Forum in Pretoria, and of course, they exchanged views with their counterpart on various issues. On the joint working group, which I indicated the program director that is managed at the ministerial level, the joint working group is one of the several structural bilateral mechanisms between the two countries. This mechanism was established in 2012 by our former President Zuma and his Chinese counterpart, President Hu Jintao. The joint working group, of course, is co-chaired by the Minister of International Relations and Cooperation and the Chinese Minister of Commerce. We'll be hosting the next meeting of the joint working group this year, and we're working hard to make sure that that becomes a success. The high-level people-to-people change mechanism, which I referred to earlier on, was launched last year in April. The idea that the people-to-people change mechanism has further added significance to the already existing strategic relations between our two countries. In addition to government-to-government engagements, it has created an opportunity for non-government entities across academia, business, and civil society to interact more frequently through organized structures. During the launch of this mechanism, the co-chairs witnessed the signing of 6 agreements and memoranda of understanding. And of course, I noted in the earlier session the view, which I think is a good one, that as academics, we may wish to look at how far we're implementing these agreements. I think is a welcome suggestion to our side. Now, coming to the forum on China-Africa cooperation. China and Africa relations are formally established under the Forum on China-Africa Cooperation, which was established in 2000 in Beijing, with the purpose of aligning and strengthening friendly socio-economic and developmental cooperation. The key objectives of FOCAC, we normally abbreviated as FOCAC, included the commitment to equal consultation, enhancing understanding, expanding consensus, strengthening friendship, and promoting cooperation. Those who are in diplomacy, if there are any in this audience, will realize that the Africa of our modern times resent being dictated to. That's why even when we engage our partners under the Africa-China cooperation, we agreed with the Chinese that it must be an equal consultation process. And indeed, so far, that is working well. Our partner, South Africa, hosted the Johannesburg Summit from 3rd to 5th December 2015, and under FOCAC, under the theme, Africa-China Progressing Together, Win-Win Cooperation for Common Development. During this summit, China pledged $60 billion for funding 4 projects. One of the key outcomes of the Johannesburg FOCAC was the adoption of the Forum on China-Africa Cooperation Johannesburg Action Plan 2016 and 2018. The plan aims to address 3 bottlenecks holding back Africa's development, namely inadequate infrastructure, lack of professional and skilled personnel, as well as funding shortages, accelerating Africa's industrialization and agricultural modernization, as well as achieving sustainable self-development. South Africa in particular is optimistic that FOCAC partnership is crucial in addressing the developmental needs of our continent. FOCAC is anchored in solidarity and friendship and encompasses a win-win formula. By embracing this element, it incorporates the African Union's Agenda 2063, its first 10-year implementation plan, and South Africa's National Development Plan in addressing the scourges of poverty, inequality, poverty, underdevelopment, as well as the infrastructure deficit. South African stakeholders and experts are already cooperating within the view of ensuring that various phases of project under the FOCAC umbrella are expedited. The science and high technology, special economic zones, and other projects in infrastructure development, oceans economy, and vocational training have been prioritized in this regard. South Africa will hand over its FOCAC co-chair at the next FOCAC summit to be hosted in China this year. The last point the program director just to touch on is the BRICS, Russia, India, China, in fact, sorry, Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, which we normally refer to as BRICS. South Africa continues to view the BRICS formation as serves as an amplified voice to advocate the shared interests of emerging and developing countries, in particular, to advance the reform of the United Nations and the Bretton Woods institutions. Since South Africa joined the BRICS formations in 2010, the developmental needs and aspirations of the Global South have been appreciatively incorporated into the BRICS agenda. South Africa assumed the chair of the BRICS grouping on the 1st of January this year, and from the 25th to the 27th of July this year, our country will host the 10th BRICS Summit, preceded by various meetings, including the foreign ministers' meetings that will be held in June. South Africa further welcomed the establishment of the BRICS financial institutions, namely the New Development Bank, headquartered in Shanghai, and the Contingent Reserve Bank. In August 2017, South Africa launched the African Regional Center of the BRICS New Development Bank that is based in Johannesburg. The African Regional Center will serve as a catalytic institution to fast-track our continental infrastructure developments. President Xi Jinping will visit South Africa to attend and participate in the BRICS Summit, which will entail a bilateral segment. This opportunity will be utilized to reflect on the 20th anniversary of the establishment of the diplomatic relations between our two countries, as well as to further strengthen our bilateral relations. Chair, I know I've taken a lot of time in closing. I would like to assure you that diplomacy remains crucial in forging deep South Africa-China diplomatic relations, and in amicably resolving whatever issues or challenges the two countries may face in the future. Allow me to commend Program Director, the organizers for this dialogue, and I appreciate the opportunity to provide an overview of South Africa-China diplomatic relations, and I look forward to the engagement with the audience. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ambassador, and I think I was remiss not to mention the fact that our Ambassador Genge is not only a diplomat, but an academic in his own right. Holds a PhD from Michigan State University in history, as well as having led the research unit at Kirko before going on to diplomatic service. All that to say that when we come to the question and answer session, we should not shy away from asking some very tough questions. Because it's not just, you don't ask only diplomatic questions. You can actually ask very critical and incisive ones as well. Of course, within the bounds of, good manners, as it were. Having said that, I would like now to invite Mr. Cobus Van Waak, who is the Managing Director of Beijing Axis, so that we move a little bit away from matters of diplomacy and international politics in the context of Africa-China, South Africa-China, and on to matters economic and very practical. Welcome.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone.
Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. Excellency, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, it's really good to be here with you. And I would like to thank the organizers for allowing me to share some perspectives. But I must say I'm really daunted, surrounded by all these scholars, diplomats, and just in a coffee session, knowing who's sitting here. I'm only a businessman, and I'm going to talk to you from that perspective. Hopefully, you will find it interesting and perhaps even useful. So I thought I'd approach this session without charts, with a lot of data. Now, anyone who knows me probably won't believe me, but I thought I'd really just share with you a few perspectives. I've been living in Asia now for more than 20 years. In fact, right after I finish here, I will run to the airport and I will hopefully still make my flight. I've just spent Chinese New Year here in South Africa, but I live in Asia. I'm mostly based in Beijing, but also spend a lot of time in Southeast Asia. And I remember a time when, with a South African passport, getting into China after I'd been to Taiwan was not even that easy. I don't know if there's anyone else here who's ever had that memory. So how things have changed. And so for me, in a way, China's become home. And so I'm going to share with you a few ideas. The first idea is that nations compete, and that is very normal, that's very natural, but fortunately they also are interdependent. And I think we're at a moment in time in South Africa, speaking as a proud South African, where there is a phenomenal opportunity given what is going on in China and what is going on in the rest of Asia. And when I was first invited to come and share some thoughts, I didn't know if I would add this next bit, but also, I can say it now, what is happening here in South Africa. So I think this is just a tremendous opportunity. So we've heard Excellency talk about some numbers. Trade has grown, investment has grown. So these numbers you could say are big, but they're actually still very small. Investment into South Africa from China, given the amount of money that China invests annually in the international market, South Africa attracts a very, very small share. In fact, despite a lot of reporting that you might have come across, Africa attracts a very small share of China's overseas investment. If you look at Europe, the US, and of course Australia, then if you put these 55 countries next to other parts of the world, we still have a very large opportunity ahead of us to attract more Chinese investment. And on the trade side, we have a gaping deficit that we need to address somehow. We have to restructure what we sell and what we import so that we have more value added in the basket that goes to China. And I'm here today to share with you that I think we can make progress. I don't think it will be easy though. I think a few things need to fall into place. But the opportunity is massive. To give you an idea, where I live in Beijing, I can walk in any direction for less than 5 minutes and be in a very large shopping mall, and I can buy blueberries from Chile, Canada, from Australia, from almost anywhere, but not from South Africa. The same goes for almost anything and everything in my shopping basket and my Chinese neighbors around me. Growth in so many commodities, so many value-added products, so many services, so many technologies in terms of the imports from the world is very, very high. Chinese have become a middle-income economy for the country, and in many provinces already well above middle income, and in some suburbs of certain parts of Beijing and many other cities already well-to-do. That opportunity is not fully, despite this history of 20 years, that opportunity is not fully appreciated here in South Africa. And that's my main point in a way, I suppose, today, is that we need to do what needs to be done to change that. China will export, China will invest, China will interact around the world, here in South Africa and in the rest of the continent. That is normal. But we need to organize better as South Africans. I think we need to think very seriously about a China strategy for the country, and if someone will tell me we have one, then I think perhaps we need a different one, or a better one, or an improved one, or an optimized one, because I go around talking to people about China every time I'm here, which is every 4 weeks, and I don't get the sense that we organized around a central thrust, if I can put it like that. So I don't mean it as a criticism, I don't mean it as a destructive grenade to lob. I think we need to stand together, work together, but we need to make a plan, and then we can do the plan. So I think that's a kind of a key point. If we have a China strategy, we can work better towards policy coordination with the Chinese. I think many countries have shown that that is possible. I think we have, in a way, also shown that can be achieved, and there's kind of a journey. But China is at a place in time now where its factories are putting up plants overseas, where Chinese companies are looking at serving customers closer to the point of sale or the point of business. China has become an expensive place to manufacture in many parts of the country. We have many things to offer. We are in one of the largest markets of the world, dynamic markets of the world, in Africa. And also, I meet very frequently with Chinese people that say to me, we struggle to buy things from South Africa. We have shopping lists. How do we buy these things? I can say it here, even we've kind of been told to go and buy it, but we still struggle. So how can we make it easier for procurement managers, supply chain managers in China that know they also need to work within the system that is China on this imbalance in the trade relationship? I think that is a real opportunity. Chinese are, for many years already integrated, Chinese businesses in international supply chains, but a lot of the skills, a lot of the capacity, language, contract negotiation, these skills are still developing. So if we can make it as easy as possible to be a market of preference to buy from, but that means we need to maybe speak Chinese. That maybe means we need websites in Chinese. That maybe means we need to be more aware of the China opportunity and so on and so forth. But the idea is that if we have a strategy as a nation that breaks down into business and academia and of course government and so on, we can work more towards policy coordination with the Chinese that are at a very interesting point in their history, and we can leverage that to our advantage. And then thirdly, we need to work together. The notion of SA Inc. or Team SA, we really need to go further with that. We need to kind of hunt in a pack and not relearn all the same lessons and make all the same mistakes. I've been saying this for years, and I think we're still not there. So this means we need to get our chambers of commerce to work together, and our industry associations and our export councils with government, with labor, with big companies, small companies, banks, lawyers, other service providers, logistics companies. We see other nations do it better. The reality is, if you talk to certain states in Australia, and you talk to certain cities, and you talk to certain South American nations that are smaller economies than ours, the way they organize for China, the way they disseminate information to exporters, it's at a different level. So whether you're a bigger economy like Australia, or a smaller economy or somewhat similar, say Chile, we have a lot to learn. There's still some things we can do better. So rather than say the glass is half empty, we can say it's half full, because we haven't done these things yet. So this idea of Team SA, or SA pulling together and working better. Fourth point would be that we need to leverage the strategic plan. Walking around in Beijing, where I've been living for many years, my wife is Chinese, so I have the Chinese mom and dad, I have uncles and aunts. The way I've been accepted is just for me a kind of cross-section of how Chinese look at South Africans in South Africa. You feel welcome. There's no political baggage that makes it uncomfortable. they're willing to include South Africa into Belt and Road Initiative and Canada, even if it has to. It's open, it's inclusive. FOCAC, BRICS, 20 years. All of this, for me, I call it the strategic plane, is favorable. But it means you need to become an insider in that and running that track, or on that track. And that will get you closer to business executives that have a shopping list to buy from abroad, or an investment list to go and invest. And we're still not aware enough of that as, and I'm perhaps here now talking more about businesses, CEOs, boards, excos, export managers across the country are not aware how many networks you have to build and how tough it can be. And if you leverage the strategic plan, how much easier it becomes. So the fifth point for me would be that we need to do all of these things. We also need to meanwhile create a China literate community in the business sector. So Chinese language, negotiation skills, awareness of China's changes and transformation, its history, its politics. You have universities around the world, institutes around the world that do this so well. We're not there yet. We still go and make a lot of mistakes. We can still sometimes be so naive. We still have mindset, Eurocentric view of the world, and when you come to China, oftentimes things are different. The culture matters. Systems, processes, protocols are different. And you're competing with the rest of the world. The reality is, if you're going to sell your blueberries or your wine or your agri-processing into China, you're competing with the world. It's a marketplace. And if we are more savvy, if we're more ready, if we're more trained in school, from the top executives to senior management, middle management, junior management, and everyone else, I think we stand a greater chance. So those are some points that I wanted to make as we stand here after 20 years. The reality is that we still have too little presence in China, given the opportunity that it is. I started the Beijing Axis 15 years ago, and so we're a management-owned business. We have offices in a few countries: India, Thailand, Singapore, and Europe, and of course in Africa. But it's very interesting to me that at this point our office in Beijing is the largest South African company office in the city. How is that possible? We're a small business. We're not large. We've done well. But if I look at similar organizations in our vein or our kind of positioning in Australia or European markets and many other countries, we should be a very tiny business. In the context of all the big players should have bigger presence, more closer to the market, and that is not the case. So I think we need to understand that China is open for business, and from multinationals, South African multinationals, to the very large private businesses, even SMEs, that you can go there. You can set up, you can do it with bricks and mortar the old way, or you can do it digitally, on a platform. But you can go there, you can meet people, you can sell things, whether it is services or technologies or products, and you can make money. You can grow your revenue. You can integrate strategically the benefits of research and technology and capital and supply chain into the rest of your business back home here in South Africa, while you penetrate the Chinese market or even in other third markets. It is possible. And then maybe just to mention that this year I think it's very important for us to work together. 20 years is a wonderful milestone. And everyone is doing something. I think people are aware of that. We're also doing a few things. So I'm an adjunct professor at UCT, at the Graduate School of Business, currently working on a white paper with Professor Mulsoko, who runs the business school there. He was just in Beijing with us. We hosted him for about a week. And we're writing with a few other institutions and organizations, also a few pieces of research. Perhaps we can pool, perhaps we can share, perhaps we can exchange. So I invite you to make contact. We've got some analysts sitting in Beijing and in other markets in Asia. Please We're organising some events as well, and again I want to thank Barry in particular, for the invitation. Hopefully we can start to work better in this Team SA way. We're running a few internships. We said to Ambassador Mzimang late last year we'll at least have in the Beijing Access Beijing office 20 South African interns over this year. And we now in the end of February we already have 5. So we've actually now said we'll make it 30 for this year. And we have a target for another 20 from other companies in Beijing, like say maybe Anglo or Standard Bank or this or that, to have at least 50 South Africans that get work experience while they visit China or perhaps that study in China. We also have regular events. We have a monthly bootstrap event where we do some young career and career development activities. We have a few scholarships this year for people, so anyone in the audience that is desperate to go and spend some time in Beijing, make contact. We also have a few things alongside BRICS that is upcoming, FOCAC that is upcoming, and some Belt and Road Initiative meetings that are upcoming in China and in other parts of Asia. So I think to share with you a few ideas, I'm going to spend 3 more minutes and just say, what you see on the screen, can you see on the screen there the cars? So that's a toll road in China. Just for anyone that hasn't really been to China or driven around China. So this is for me almost symbolic of the market is on the other side of the toll road and we need to go and queue up. You can see 40 lanes of cars trying to just, get through to the other side. And the market is that big. Everyone in a car there is wearing a pair of shoes, is maybe eating almonds or cashew nuts or drinking wine or going on an overseas holiday sometime in the next few months. And they have money and that they want to spend. And it's not an abstract idea, it's not floating in the ether. You can sit today and make a plan and within weeks, if not that, at least within months, be selling. And this mindset we need to inculcate here in South Africa within businesses. And the only way we can do that, I think, is if we're very proactive and maybe even follow some of the points that I raised earlier on. But the point is the market is real. Wherever you go, shopping malls, whether it's on the consumer segment or the industrial segment, you have large numbers of people that have come up that had, when they grew up, food stamps, some of them that had no symbols of status. It might have been a watch, it might have been a sideboard against the wall. Now they own houses, second houses, cars, second cars. They change phones every few months. They have many TVs. Chinese households have many TVs, 5, 6, 7, 8 TVs. And so that consumption culture, it's our opportunity here. Other people have recognized it already. And the reality is that, China is also surrounded by a very big market. If you take that circle, 50%, more than 50% of the world lives inside that circle. That's a small area relative to the rest of the world. If you want to be even more specific, China, India, and Indonesia make up 40% of global emerging market wallet size. So if we're a business in Johannesburg and we don't have money to go and conquer the world, let's just go and conquer these 3. We can afford the management time, we can afford the flights, we can afford the research, because it becomes more bite-sized, more focused. So we need to move from the general to the specific. And one can cluster the markets, of course, as emerging markets and some developing markets and some developed markets. And if we talk about China, it's a $12 trillion economy. What is Africa now? 2, 2.5? 55 countries, 2.5 trillion. China, 1 country, 12 trillion. China's imports in the last year, just under $2 trillion. South Africa's GDP, 300 billion. So 7 times. So the scale and the magnitude of this opportunity it's off the charts in terms of how we write numbers here in Johannesburg. but the awareness is not there. And I think we've made huge progress over the last 20 years. We have to acknowledge that. And I think that's wonderful. But we haven't optimized it as Team SA. We simply haven't. And I think we need to also acknowledge that. And if we work together, I think we can make a great benefit for women. Just to show the size and scale of the Chinese economy, you can see the big bubble, that's the size of the economy. Even Japan is much smaller, and everyone else in Asia is much, much smaller than that. And even Australia is much smaller than that. But you can see China still has a very high way to go, a long way to go in terms of moving vertically up as it becomes wealthier. So the basket of what Chinese want to consume is constantly changing. But China is still maintaining and sustaining a very high rate of growth, 6.5% or thereabouts for some years to come. Opportunity. But China is also acting with self-interest. It's a trading nation, it's been that for many, many years. You can see the red circles and the green circles. South Africa has a red circle, that means we have a deficit with China. You can see some of the red bars for regions. Most regions have a deficit with China. Most countries have a deficit with China, but some don't. And some of them are even different from one another, which means that you don't have to be a certain type of economy to have a surplus. Meaning, because we are like this as South Africa, we can never have a better balanced trade situation because we this type of economy. No, I think that is not the case. I think if we optimize our strategy, the way we work from government to organized business to, in a boardroom, a specific boardroom, we can do a lot. And then just the fact is the Chinese are buying a lot of things from overseas. Almost coming to $2 trillion a year. It's annuity income. If you're selling to them, they're going to be there next year. So let's start thinking what we can do. Across other Asian markets as well, one can very carefully assess what it is that they buy from overseas. I just put up here China, Japan, and a few other economies in Asia. What are the big imports? And for China, imports comes from everywhere, but we are, we're not in the top 15 or so in supplying into China, so we have a long way to go. We also have data, by the way, for anyone here interested in what every single country in the world exports to China. And it's always interesting to look at the type of economy and what it sells to China. Because China buys $2 trillion, $1.7 trillion. What does it buy? It buys a lot of manufactured goods. It buys a lot of things we actually manufacture and sell to Europe, but we haven't thought yet to make more of it tap into the Chinese market. So I know that's a very general statement, but I think one can sit down and unpack that, and I think I can justify and validate what I just said to you if you're interested. So the opportunity is bigger than what we're grasping at the moment, which I hope to be my central message. Sectors such as food, nutrition, agri-processing, luxury, premium, discerning consumers, we can target that. The wider consumer market, there's new consumerism, services. We have a phenomenal services. Everyone works for one of the best financial institutions in the world, I think it's fair to say. And we have a few of them. And if you think of banking, or you think of insurance, or you think of IT and systems, safety in mining, if you think of so many other areas where the Chinese now are saying, we want to change the way we work. We want to be efficient, energy efficient. We want to be safe. We want to have a clean environment. When I'm here, I just look up at the sky all day. We have something they don't have at the moment. We can help. So the opportunity is, it's out there, and it's in many, many places. So technology, best practice, know-how. If you know something as an individual sitting in this audience, or if you talk to an individual later today, if you know something where you're the best in the country or the best in the world, perhaps even, you can find a Chinese partner, you can create a website, you can sell that service. People are doing that as we sit here. China open for business today. It was 7 days of holiday, but today it's open for business. So I don't mean this sort of generally, I mean specifically if you know about deep level mining, or you know about scrubbers that clean, you know, emissions that go out of a textile mill or a paper mill into the air, or you know, how to do operations consulting to get the throughput in you know, aluminium process plant to go up. These are various kinds of disciplines that the Chinese are now hungrily importing from our competitors. Because we're not there, we're not aware, we don't speak Chinese, we haven't partnered, we're not an insider. And that I think, and then just high net worth individuals are upon so many things, you know, everywhere around the world. And I'm sure there's some of that that can also serve us well if we do. But you need to get it right, so there's a bit of strategy work that's necessary and certain behavioral patterns. It brings me back to that point of the astuteness of our executives and Team SA. And yeah, maybe not to delve into this my last slide, but just to say that you know, a strategic approach, a research-based approach, a systematic approach, you know, a thoughtful approach with good implementation can make a huge difference. And then finally, just if there happens to be anyone in the audience with a product that's export ready, where you've succeeded internationally already, that you somehow have not targeted China, you want to, please talk to us. That is one of our offices in Beijing. It's an incubator platform for exports from South Africa into the country. We can't help everyone, so let's manage expectations up front. But if you're export ready and you're already working out, maybe you're selling to Japan, or you're selling to Germany, or you're selling to, you know, traditional markets that we learned about export many, many years ago, and you know it can work in China, please talk to us. Thank you.
Thank you, Cobus. I think Cobus has been so persuasive that you know, your presentation is so persuasive that we risk the possibility that some of us who are academics or journalists or researchers here might have been defected from our academic and research work to try and start selling products to Beijing. Nonetheless, I think one key takeaway from the presentation is that we can collaborate as academics, researchers, journalists, and so forth, with the people who are very pragmatic, you know, so that I mean, you know, those of us who want knowledge for knowledge's sake, and those of us who want to make money can actually work together, and it's not a bad thing. So I think now I'll invite Mr. Aaron Pon, who is the chairman of the Chinese Association Gauteng, to give his presentation, and thereafter then we'll go into the question and answer session. Aaron, take it.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair, and thank you very much to the Wits Africa-China Reporting Project and China Daily for having me here today. Thank you very much for the invitation. Your Excellency, Ambassador, thank you. To all of you, thank you very much. And Cobus, I was waiting for when I was going to see the slides of all your graphs and things like that. I thought you know, it'd be a change. Without it, it wouldn't be the same. But I think I'm here just going to chat to you around about the softer issues and really around our community. I'm a fourth, as a background, I'm a fourth generation Chinese South African. So I'm born here in South Africa. So my parents grew up in Sophia Town as well. And you know, and I'm really here just to bring all the different things together. The TCA is called the Chinese Association. It used to be called the Chinese Association. It was established in 1903 and is also one of the oldest Chinese associations here in South Africa. Primary objective, as Melanie also mentioned, with associations in those days, was to support and help the Chinese that were here. So whether it's settling down here in South Africa, or whether it was assisting them with visas, working permits, or even just writing letters and delivering it back home. Those are the things that the Chinese Association did, and really look after the interests of the Chinese people. The TCA's objective and mission hasn't changed throughout the years, and is still the same, to look after the interests of the Chinese. primarily just by who we are. The majority of our members are the older local Chinese, we call them, where they've actually been born here in South Africa and are from here for many generations. Although we do interact a lot with the new Chinese that are coming through, and that's also part of our mission. I think, as Yushan mentioned earlier on, it's quite complex in terms of the different groupings of Chinese people and Chinese groups here in South Africa and Africa. From the business side, you have the large state-owned enterprises, you have the private enterprises, and then you have the SME individuals and traders as well. And each one of those interact differently, have different objectives, do business differently, etc. And likewise with the communities here in South Africa as well. We used to be one of a few Chinese associations. And in recent years now, there's up to around about 60, 70 real active Chinese associations now in South Africa, representing different parts and bodies of the community. So, as an outsider, you might find it a bit challenging. It's not just one China Inc. and everything operates under one China Inc. banner. Internally as well, we have our own challenges and issues as well in dealing with it as well. But that other part of the Chinese Association of our objectives is to also unite our Chinese community, to create common understanding with our community as well. And then the other part then is to also expose our Chinese culture and our traditions also to the broader Chinese communities as well. Because we do believe that a real misunderstandings and that can come through better understanding of each other's culture, of who we are as people, of who we are as different colors, skin, different traditions. So what we try to do as well is to try and introduce our traditions as well to the broader communities. So for example, we hold different events. There's a Chinese New Year. This weekend we're having it in the old Chinatown. Next weekend there will be the Chinese New Year celebration in the new Chinatown. And then we're having various lantern festivals, festivities also in one of the China malls as well. And through this, we believe that we can create better understanding amongst all different types of people. Part of the challenges that we as a Chinese community also face with is the negative perceptions sometimes of Chinese people here in South Africa and Africa. How do we try to tackle those? There was a question before of what can we do? And we truly believe that it's through further engagement, it's through more discussions and talks like these, whereby we can create better understanding of each other. And only through that then can we really avoid these misunderstandings. But it's also to highlight, as Kobus also mentioned, China is changing all the time. And the environment is changing. And the people are changing. The education system is changing. People are being educated overseas, coming back. There's a change in ideas and assimilation. There's also, change, various different changes. And just to highlight, for example, my great-grandfather came in the 1890s. My grandmother came in the 1930s. And when she came across, she brought the China that was there in the 1930s. So some of the Chinese cultures and traditions that we practice nowadays is very different still from that of China. And actually, it's actually a lot more traditional than some of it in China. Just for example, the Tomb Sweeping Festival. They celebrated once in China, once a year in China, but we still celebrate it here as a local Chinese twice a year, because that was what it was celebrated in the 30s. So we've almost got a little capsule of what China was in the 30s, and we still practice those type of traditions here today. So it's not, so if I could just say anything really as a highlight or my key point around here is that when dealing with China or Chinese companies or Chinese people and Chinese groupings, it is very different, and it is always changing. And just as we as Kobus mentioned, we should learn a lot more about China and how to do business and how to interact, etc. Also to note that the Chinese people are also learning a lot about doing business outside, about this new environment. And from the business side, I mean, you know, they understand there are certain rules and laws, and I would say the majority of the companies that I deal with in my other capacity do obey those laws. I mean, the companies come across and they say, okay, what is it? What are the factors we need to take into account? Oh, okay, there's BEE. Okay, great. We'll put it into our modeling, and we'll say we need to account for BEE. We have to do this. We have to do that. We have to hire local employees. We have to do training, etc. And you will see that. And the companies I mainly deal with are on the SOE level as well. So it will be different again in dealing with the private enterprises and the SMEs as well. But I hope that just gives you a little bit of an insight that it's not just one level, one China Inc. that you deal with. There's many, and if anything, trying to get to understand and to know more about those different groupings. And join in our festivities as well. So you're welcome to come this weekend, next weekend if you can't, and we welcome you to our Chinese New Year celebrations. Thank you.
Thank you, Owen. I think one of the key points that comes out of this is the suggestion and the indications by Owen that actually the Chinese, South African Chinese, or Chinese South Africa for that matter, are more authentic than the Chinese people in China. I think that's what you're suggesting, that, because you've followed certain mores and cultures and traditions that the ancient Chinese came in from China. You might actually be authentic than the Chinese people, particularly given the point that under Mao Zedong, there was that cultural revolution where, among other things, Mao Zedong said, to be a religious person is to be a heretic. You have something, there's something the matter with your head if you are too religious. Anyway, with those presentations, I think we now go straight on to the question and answer session. Like as with the previous session, the morning session, we want people to raise up their hands if they have questions. Quick introduction, indicate to whom the question should be directed. We'll pick 3 to start with. I can see a hand right at the top, at the back. 1, 2, 3. Let's start with those 3. So at the very back, find yourself to me a microphone, yes?
Thank you. My name is Siko. I'm actually doing a third year Wits, doing BCom. Basically, my question is directed to Mr. Beng. Mr. Beng. Now, there's one thing, actually, let me just open up with this. There is a saying, the Chinese saying that says that is, don't give a man a fish, teach him how to fish. And I find that saying very relevant in this talk, in this dialogue. Why am I saying that? Is because I have this feeling that, especially in the South African continent, in terms of how we trade with China, is that sometimes we play, kind of like pride ourselves on the pledges that we receive. That's not just in South Africa alone, but in the African continent in general. That there's so much strategic investment China makes, especially to this to develop. That is the continent, including South Africa, the pledge that you Mr. Beng was speaking about in terms of industrialization and the agricultural modernization. So that's good, but my biggest concern is that what are we really learning? Because our trading partners have been here for a long time and they've been doing the same thing. Contribute something, but those things are actually But what are we really learning from them? Especially in the context of industrialization, we don't have that capacity, especially in South Africa, to kind of like produce our own things. As a matter of fact, Mr. Cooper spoke of something very clear, kind of like speaking of what I'm talking about here, that in our trade, our long-standing trade with China, is that we're not really surpassing it, making much profit in terms of what we're doing with them. But they are making a lot of profit because why? Whatever, for example, they come and they buy something, they import products. Those products are raw materials. and what they do in return. They sell those products as a finished product in 3 terms of value. So that's exactly what I'm saying now. My question to Mr. Beng is that what are we really learning from our trade? Are we really doing something?
The point is taken. Sure, thank you. Medu? Yeah.
Actually, more like a comment than the question to
the comment should be summarized so that we don't get into too much time.
No, that's fine. As I say, he made a very good point because now he's talking different aspect or perspective about the South African way or South African business community. Are we really prepared? Are we really prepared to engage with China to attract the Chinese investment? So, of course, as I understand, Beijing actually has done a great job to promote, but still, the people, as I said as a comment, I hope more people will understand that kind of necessity to them to be prepared. Thanks.
All right.
Luanda Mwase from the South African Institute of International Affairs. Thank you, Chair, for the opportunity to pose my question. 2 very brief questions. I think today I've heard a lot about Chinese engagement in Africa. And as Yushan mentioned earlier in her presentation about the South African engagement in China, and from a people-to-people diplomacy perspective, I mean, some similarities we share with China is a very, very, very rich culture. And having had a brief experience in China where like the regular citizen was not exposed to a person that looks like myself, and it was shocking. And when I told them that I'm from South Africa, the only thing that they really remembered was Nelson Mandela, if they remembered anything at all. Is there anything more perhaps that we should be advancing in South Africa in our culture, because I think that's an easy win. And my second question is to Kobus, who painted a very, very good and very informative picture about business in China. Please can you explain a little bit more about the BRICS stuff that you mentioned in your presentation? What is the work that you do within the BRICS? Thank you.
Thanks. I think we'll have the responses now. I think the first question can be answered by both Ambassador Genge and Erwin on matters culture. What can we do on our end? Okay. Then we'll do another round. I think beginning with, anybody wants to take the lead? Do we defer to the ambassador? Yeah. Okay. All protocols of that. Yes.
Thank you, Program Director. The 20 years may sound as a long time, it's a short time. Very, very short time. Because your question is, what is it that we're learning from China? The Vice Chancellor, the Deputy Vice Chancellor, you are here in the morning, made a point which I want to amplify. Before the 20 years, most of our orientation as South Africa was more towards the West. Long, very long established orientation. Now you come with 20 years with China, and what you are learning. Of course, the learning is mutual. It's not one, it's mutual. Chinese also are learning some of the things from our side. I've mentioned in my presentation that we have now a number of students in China. Again, we are investing by sending our students to study in China. We hope that when they come back, they will come back with some knowledge of how Chinese are doing whatever they're doing. Like Kopas was saying, the Chinese culture, the Chinese protocol, and the Chinese business acumen. On our side, the Chinese, although they won't get on top of the roof and say what they're learning, they are also appreciating our financial institutions. The discipline, the competency we have surpasses them. In fact, as Kobas was alluding to BRICS, and which I did myself, one of the strengths in our country in BRICS is our financial institutions, how we have managed them. We are smaller in size with all our partners in BRICS in terms of population size, but in terms of skills and other professions we have, they are also learning. China has just opened up its economy, and we've long had an open economy, market economy in this country. And one of the things that we share with the Chinese, of course, is how to navigate the open market economy. And when we now coming to the culture, the culture part, that was raised as to, we launched the forum people-to-people exchange mechanism last year. We are still developing our culture. And of course, there's a lot that we can market in terms of our own culture to China. But we are still in the process of establishing our artists. Because on our side, the Department of Arts, one of the things that is doing is organizing artists, so that when we have activities with China, we have a group of artists that can showcase what we have. In diplomacy in general, we have what is called cultural diplomacy. It's an aspect that we also champion with all the countries, not only with China, but we are working on that. I think I don't want to go past that.
I will leave the difficult bits for him, but let me just try to respond to the specific question. So we said, as a business, we need to have clients in every BRICS country. We see BRICS as a construct, even if South Africa is really the briquette, as a big opportunity as a business. So we have clients in Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa. I, as the leader of this business, have been to every single BRICS summit as far back as they started. We always host breakfasts and events on the sidelines of every BRICS summit, and specifically the business forum, just like we just did most recently in Xiamen in China, and we hope to do in Sandton in July. We have a presence in every BRICS country. We do some research and white papers on BRICS and the interrelationship, economic, business relationship between these countries. And if you come to our office in Beijing today, you will find people, young interns, students studying in Beijing from every country in BRICS. So these are just a few examples, which for us is us being true to the idea that our strategy is to leverage the strategic plane. We're a business, we're up against many forces, competitive forces, so we must leverage the strategic plane. BRICS is a gift in our lap. You know, we are a small business, but suddenly we can go to BRICS and meet the chairman of Tata, the biggest company in India, or posterity, the biggest private conglomerate in Brazil. Both are our clients today. So this is what I think, you know, what I'm thinking when I say we can optimize the way we engage by leveraging the strategic plan.
Yeah, just also from the cultural aspect, to also touch on what Koop has also mentioned before, is creating this South Africa Inc., the South Africa strategic body that can go out to educate. And actually when you go out there, you don't only just do business with the Chinese, you must educate them also about our rich South African cultural heritage. You didn't only experience it yourself. When I go to China and they ask me, where are you from? I say, I'm from South Africa, I'm born there. And they say, you're not black. So I get it as well. So, and also I do speak Mandarin Cantonese as well, but I also do have a bit of an accent so they can hear as well. But I think also in terms of the BRICS, so as my day job, I'm in investment banking in one of the large corporates here, banks here in South Africa, and I head up the China-Africa investments. And from the big BRICS side, and also to Ambassador's point on His Excellency is correct, we are working a lot with a lot of the Chinese banks as well as the BRICS Bank as well. And the way on which they do their financing and banking is very, very different. It's very Chinese oriented. It's quite a closed system. Doing business and financing here in Africa is also very different. So we hold also different classes. I'm holding one later on this afternoon with the China-Africa Development Fund. Around project financing as well. There's a lot of infrastructure projects that we do here in Africa and that the Chinese are also interested in. So there is the two-way street in terms of the learning. Some of the other Chinese corporates, to answer your question, Huawei have a very big training facility over here that educates our local South Africans around the new technologies. Hisense down in Cape Town over there, the creation, the manufacturing of the television sets and refrigerators, etc. A lot of education of local South Africans as well. So there is a lot that they also try to educate our local communities as well. But I think the problem also of like, why don't these guys start their own business as well is a bit of it's a bigger question that you ask around the South African environment, which we as South Africans come up with all the time, and that is creating the capacity for SMEs, small businesses, to grow. So it's not just only a Chinese South African type of thing, it's a broader South African economy problem. And just in terms of, I think it was your question around FOCAC, one of the initiatives from FOCAC as well was the relief of aid of some debt to Mozambique that came out of that as well. There's also SME funding into South Africa from the China Development Bank, also coming off from the FOCAC meeting that they had. They've already dispersed $300 million into the system. And when I say the China Development Bank is issuing these SME loans, it's to non-Chinese SMEs. And there's certain rules, but it doesn't have to have any links with China as well. So it's a real initiative to try and grow the South African economy as well. So there's various type of initiatives that they are trying to go back and forth as well.
Okay, I think let's take the next round of questions, and even though Cobas has left, not to worry, as you can see, Awin wears two hats actually. He's a business development manager at Rand Merchant Bank, in addition to being chairman of the Chinese Association of Gauteng. So he can handle both matters culture and move on very quickly to matters money. So you need not worry. So I saw a hand at the top, right? 1, 2, 3, and 4 at the top. Okay, so here we go.
Thank you for a good presentation. I'd like to check. I've been struggling to understand this grouping of a country vis-a-vis a continent. Africa, China, Africa, France. I'm not sure, because Mo Ibrahim says everything that will group Africa as if it's one homogeneous country should be taken with a pinch of salt. So I'd like to understand, how do we get to a point where we group a continent vis-a-vis country? Because I think we are not taking ourselves serious as Africans. That's why we have people like a French president who will come with a page that is written Africa speech, as if it's one homogeneous country. That's why we have, even last week, it was shown that in a celebration in China, there was where a woman was carried, where a woman, what was happening with the Chinese women, and she has been painted black, and her buttocks were caricatured and exaggerated to look like an African woman. And when they were asking that this is racist, a Chinese came back and said, no, we are strengthening and reinforcing ties between Africa and China. So I'm saying, I think we are not taking ourselves too serious. That's why we have people who will come, as I've said, with a page and say this is Africa's speech. Thank you.
All right. In the middle, there was someone. All right, here, yes. Lucy?
Mine will be a rejoinder from what he's just asked.
Your question was, is a question to the presenters, not a rejoinder.
Yeah. It's more than less. It relates closely to what he's asked. I would like to ask, what are the challenges? Because we know that China has a China-Africa policy. So what are the challenges towards actually having an Africa-China policy? My second is the people-to-people mechanisms that the ambassador talked about, that was launched last year between South Africa and China. I'd like to know what has been the benefits, or what are the takeaways that other African countries can pick from it and develop in their own capacities. And then the third one was for Cobas, but he's left. He actually talked about very small presence of South Africa or African business community in China. I would like to ask, because we have embassies, most African countries have embassies in China, what are they doing to ensure that the business communities in Africa identify and tap into the opportunities China presents?
All right, I think there was a question right here at the end, Prof. Yeah.
Hello, my name is Ivy Onami. I'm an architectural honors student at the University of Wits. So my question is mostly on the social cultural aspect. From the two presentations we've had, one in the morning and right now, I wanted to ask if there is a disconnect with the South African Chinese and the newly Chinese immigrants that are coming to South Africa right now. And secondly, it's more on how we can, as a built environment, create a social cultural space where South Africans can interact with Chinese, both South African Chinese and Chinese immigrants, and probably learn more about their culture, because I feel there's a disconnect, and the only transitional spaces where most of us can learn is if we go to Chinatown. And as a foreigner, I'm not really South African, already entering Chinatown has its language barriers. So is there anything the government or institutions are trying to do culturally to integrate the community?
All right, thanks for the question. I think also we need to note that there are some researchers here who do work on, in the room actually, who do work on Chinese spaces in Johannesburg from your own school actually. Is it school or department? But, thanks for the question. At the top.
Hi, my name is Vivid and I work in digital. My question was more to Kobus, but perhaps Irvin, with his experience in business and going to China, might be able to answer. It was more around well, Kobus's time has been 20 years. That would have been the time that companies like Tencent, which is 20% owned by Naspers, and Alibaba have risen. So my question was more around how the government has played a role in sort of helping these companies grow and how that can be sort of replicated in Africa. For example, in South Africa, the last sort of digital company from a social perspective that actually grew was founded by a Namibian Stellenbosch, which was Mixer, which was God, that's so long ago, and nothing really has blown up in that sector directly. More around how what China has done, how these companies grew at that rapid scale. I mean, Tencent and Alibaba, it's really insane how they've grown. Thanks.
So let me ask, is there any other person with a question? Because after the response from the ambassador and Arwin, we shall close and move on for lunch. So any last ones? Those two hands, any other on this side? You forever keep silent if you're not raising your hand. So those two, I think just make sure you summarize your questions because we are out of time actually.
Okay, thank you, Chair. I'll be brief. My question, I wanted to pose it to Kobus, but unfortunately he's left. But I think the ambassador and Edwin will answer that maybe. My question is, we see now that the world is moving on we're in the fourth revolution, industrial revolution. But reports we receive is that China is sort of reluctant to move into the digital currency. We saw some of the companies which were in China moving, actually were barred from operating in China. Those were creating cryptocurrencies. They moved to Japan and South Korea. So why is China reluctant to move into the cryptocurrency? Thank you.
Okay. Time goes seasoning. I just wanted to make a point in relation to the question that was asked behind me. I would imagine that obviously there is a fair amount of ignorance among the peoples, and the perhaps prejudice and all the other misunderstandings come in. But in my view, the approach would probably be informed. The idea of China, Africa, or America, Africa, and all of that, by perhaps the economies of scale. I mean, China is more than 1 billion, and we're fast approaching that. We're just a little bit on the side of it. So, in a way where you're obviously looking to maximize your trade, you also have to look into units, how far you can. In any case, I think in line with our objectives of collapsing the borders, at least at the level of trade, it could be said that we're working towards a common strategy as Africans of how best to represent all the common aspects of interest within the small countries within Africa itself. But now, here's my, what you call as well, my little prejudicial question, Mr. Paul. Do you guys really eat men's best friend, the dog?
All right. Just a quick note to point out that we expected to break for lunch at noon, but our lunch is a bit delayed. You can be sure it's lunch is the way. Don't worry. It's just delayed. So even though we are salivating now to go for lunch, but we'll hang on a bit until about 12:30, then we do lunch. So I think let's proceed with the responses from the podium here, starting with the ambassador.
Program director, I think these are difficult questions. Let me start with the first one. No. If you cast your net wider, you will realize that it is not any specific European country with Africa in terms of groupings. We have EU-Africa forum. Therefore, EU itself is a collective. And of course, you move them to say to me, we have Japan, Africa, China, Africa, and South Korea, Africa. I wish you can expose how these forums work. First, the African Union. Let's leave the FOCAC one. The African Union is a central coordinating center for these forums. But I've got EU, Africa, and of course we've got EU, South Africa as well. But when we talk about EU, Africa, China, EU, Africa, Japan, Africa, South Korea, Africa, the African Union is the coordinating center. And of course, African countries have various interests, and the EU, when it's engaging these countries, is managing those interests. Part of the development of the Africa Agenda 2063 was to coordinate the positions of the African Union, positions of the African states, into a coherent way of engaging other countries. And I think the gentleman that was talking about the economies of scale is spot on. Some of the points about these forums, economies of scale. Take, for example, Lesotho, without belittling the country. If China, for example, were to have a forum with Lesotho as one country, what benefit would it get? Just economies of scale. And Africa continuously engaging the global community. And one of the examples of that, this continuous engagement, Africa is on record in terms of wanting a reformed United Nations Security Council. That reformation of that council, we are saying Africa must be represented. And the world is listening. It's not accurate to say we're not taken seriously. And of course, I'll talk from the point of diplomacy. In diplomacy, you don't just talk and things happen. No, it doesn't work that way. You cultivate a long-term understanding. It's a pity that Kobas has gone. What Kobas was alluding to when he said, we need to have a sense of how the Chinese operate, how they do business, their culture, their protocols. And it is that you win over the confidence of states when you deal with. When they have a sense that you have appreciation of their own peculiar situation, and then you make them to understand yours as well, then you move forward. It is not just that you say we're a bunch of countries that are not taken seriously. Let me give you the last example. I did mention in my presentation that the FOCAC summit that we hosted in 2015 was the first summit of FOCAC at that level. All along, FOCAC has been managed at ministerial level. African leadership engage in the Chinese leadership, and let's elevate this to a higher level. That is to the presidential level. It's not that we are not taken serious. Then on that point, the the challenges, what are challenges to Africa-China policy? The African continent has not yet come up with its own policy. It has come up with its own blueprint, the Africa Agenda 2063, and there's various phases of implementation. Of course, even with that, one would say some of the challenges that countries have their national interests. In the pursuit of national interest, then you may find variations of emphasis, how they engage with other countries. I've mentioned FOCAC, which is Africa-China Forum, and the pledge that the Chinese have made. How African countries have benefited from that pledge varies, because when it comes to the business of the day in terms of access to that, each country enters into a contract with a Chinese banker, a Chinese financer for that fund. It's not a blanket one. And each country must account to its own internal processes of how these are concessions, these are loans, this pledging. It's not free money. It's loans and concessional loans. Therefore, there are mechanisms that have to be followed by each country. And countries vary in their way how they borrow money. It's a very delicate process. And of course, then the last question is, what can other countries benefit from the people-to-people exchange mechanism? This, of course, the people-to-people exchange mechanism is a Chinese way of dealing with the world in the cultural aspect. As we speak, there are about 6 or 7 of these entities. On the African continent, we are the first one, and after us, we're followed by Germany, and of course, there's US and other countries. And it is, I think it is how countries will position themselves and how they think that their relations have grown to a comfortable level with China. And of course, in terms of what I think the value from what we have seen is cultural exchange and also student exchange. Within this program, we have the education sector that affected strongly. That's why I've mentioned the number of students we have in China. And every year, we are sending students to study in China. And as I said, it's the investment. We are of the view that when those students come back, some will go to business, they will go to various sectors, but they will assist South Africa to have a sense of how we deal with China. And I think in addition to what I read from my panel colleague here about the Chinese culture and the Chinese community in South Africa, that also can make a contribution. I want to answer the one that maybe you can answer the one that on how China, why China is refusing to embrace the inclusion. The finance one. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
So I think Ambassador already mentioned around Africa as one, and I think that was the reason why FOCAC was established, to really represent each and every African country, because it realized that it cannot deal with just one, and Africa is not just one. So that was the importance of FOCAC. I think it's important to know that BRICS has also started a bank. That the bank that they've just started is called the New Development Bank. They purposely chose not to use BRICS Bank because some people refer to it BRICS Bank, and the real reason behind that is also that they would like to encompass and bring in other different countries as well, not to say that this bank, this New Development Bank, this BRICS Bank is only going to focus on those 5 different countries. So that's the question around Africa. Racist black lady issue. I'll be very honest with you. When we, as the local Chinese, when we saw that skit, we closed our eyes and we said, no, this can't be happening. And so we were shocked as well. And I think that is also then to the point that I wanted to highlight, that there's a lot of education. I'm not going to defend that it wasn't us. When I say us, the local the Chinese here in South Africa. But I think it's indefensible, but I think they will learn, and I think there's a continual learning that must happen. Was it wrong? I think it definitely was wrong. And that is the feeling also from our local internal, our community as well, and our social groups. Is there a disconnect between the new Chinese and the old overseas Chinese, etc.? I think there is, and that's why I mentioned that that's part of the job that we as a Chinese association here that's been here for a while, as part of our role. It's, I think there's key learnings from both sides. Even though I mentioned some of my culture and traditions may be older, you know, there's a big gap in terms of how China's progressed, and we're learning from China as well. We choose to learn the good things, they choose to learn the good things from us as well. And I think as society, that's what we should always focus on. Is there areas whereby we can, other than these Chinese New Year festivals, etc., I think that's a start. I think there's a lot more that we can do. I think there's a lot more dialogue to really create this understanding between local Chinese, overseas Chinese, immigrants, South African, doesn't matter wherever it is, across different cultures, across different communities. I think that is really, really important. I think the importance really is that we are living now in a world village where everybody's going everywhere, coming here, not only, I mean, South Africans are going out. I mean, you go, you know, all different countries, you'll see people and different cultures. And it's really, really important for us to really respect and understand those different cultures before we can move on. So, to your point, I think there are different things that we can continue to do, but the easiest ones, the informal ones, or the, you know, are really those events and really partake into them. Melanie mentioned sometimes when she goes to Cyril Dean, sometimes it's hard for her to also order food and things like that. So it's not only you guys that will find a challenge, or non-Chinese that will find a challenge. The local Chinese also find it as a challenge, and it's something that we are continually trying to work on. And as mentioned, through events, through festivities, we can really embrace and learn about each other as well. What Africans can do in China and what is... So, Chinese government, yes, if anything, they do offer good support to their companies. You mentioned on the IT side, the 10 cents. So, they create these special economic zones, and these economic zones really work. It's not just an area whereby you can just go and you say, well, there's some infrastructure there. There's really tax breaks. There's really, they supply free computers, for example, and you can go there and you can just out there, free training, whatever it is, you know, whatever programming language you like to learn about. They provide these different centers and really enable growth and education of people so they can start their own businesses. I remember Ambassador was saying to us, Ambassador Lin, who's just arrived in South Africa a few months ago, he was just saying that here in South Africa we are worried about unemployment, which is fine. It is a problem. In China, there are also thousands of people that lose their job on a daily basis. But what does China do to refocus that? Is to focus on creating new jobs and creating new industries. Because if you focus, just for example, on when the internet came in, and you're doing emails now, and you just focus on, let's just save the post office, let's save the letters, and all that, you're going to fall behind because the technology, and you mentioned the fourth industrial revolution, and I'll get to that, it is moving forward. So if you focus on the old and try saving the old, it's a problem. The Chinese are trying to say, okay, things are changing. How do we focus on the new? Let's not worry too much about the 10,000 people that are losing their jobs. Let's focus on the 50,000 jobs that we are creating in a new industry, in a new sector. And they do push that. So there's the support and strength of the Chinese government pushing those type of industries. And I think those are the things that we can learn here in South Africa as well. South African companies have tried in China, and the most successful one, as I was going to mention, is definitely NASPA's investment in Tencent. Discovery is making great inroads into China as well with their Vitality offering. And with their Vitality offering, it's done very, very well here in South Africa. The most Vitality members, I heard yesterday Adrian was saying, outside of South Africa, or even the world, is in China now. So Vitality is being, and this healthy living is part of this new age that Kobus was also mentioning in China. China went through different phases and different stages. First it was all around big is better, so let's use a lot and then buy things. And now they're focusing really on quality now. quality versus quantity. So that's why you're finding a lot of people now worried about the environment, worried about different aspects. And I mean, we talk about environment, you know, they spend the most money anywhere in this world around renewable energy and creating renewable energy. Because guess what? When there's pollution in China, it doesn't affect the rest of the world first. It's their own Chinese people that suffer. So it's these things that they're really focusing on.
Okay, so
sorry, there was one more question that I just wanted to answer. Sorry, and that was really, sorry, there's two more. Sorry, around cryptocurrency, fourth generation. So they are not around, no, they're not against necessarily the cryptocurrency. So the idea around technology behind it is probably going to be the future. Blockchain technology, financing, registering different assets, things like that. The ability of of blockchain itself is very, very important, and China is aware of that. If you go into China, you don't even have to take your wallet. You just use your phone. You can go and buy food, you can get a taxi, everything using technology. So it's not behind. If anything, it's actually advanced. The main reason why it was cutting down on cryptocurrency was around the foreign exchange that was potentially leaving the country. The other uses of cryptocurrency in terms of fraudulent activity, in terms of money laundering, and it's not only a China issue. If you were at Davos as well, there was a session at Davos where they were reluctant to name it a currency. It was a way of payment, but the actual currency itself representing like a US dollar or something like that, they were a bit reluctant to it because it's being used for other purposes as well. So there's reasons why China banned cryptocurrencies, and it's not for the reason of technology. Final point, no, I've never eaten dog. And I think that also highlights the other point that through more understanding, we will learn about each other's cultures. Have there been people that eat dogs? Are there certain? Yes, there definitely are. But to label that all Chinese eat dogs, no. Our Chinese, in fact, if you go to Shanghai, Beijing, and you actually see how they treat some of their animals and dogs, you'll be shocked at how good they are. They live a better life than sometimes me or you. They get weekly massages and pampered and things like that. So the way in which they're evolving and learning, and really, it's phenomenal. And the way in which they care for the environment, like I mentioned, we had some students that came across here that were writing a white paper around how can we save the environment. And part of that was also against rhino trade, against the elephant trade, etc. And that was one of the COVOCAC initiatives as well, and the ban on rhino horns, elephant trade and tusks and things like it was implemented as well. So, but what I also wanted just to finalize is it's important that we do put our voices into how we can change this narrative, important how we can change the policies that are moving forward. The FOCAC initiatives and things like that, it's important for us to put our voices there. Because when these things get tabled at FOCAC or at BRICS, and they get agreed on by the leadership, the way in which China culture works is that it will propagate and it will filter through down to the rest of the other levels and the other associations and other bodies to make sure that they implement it. So FOCAC is, we cannot underestimate the importance of FOCAC and the voice that we need to use at FOCAC to create the balanced view of between and trade, to be real, to create this real win-win relationship between Africa and China.
Chair, there's one question I did not respond to, which was what can African ambassadors based in China do to benefit their countries? You know, the duty of an ambassador, by and large, is the mandate of his or her country to the host country. And countries compete and, of course, reinforce each other. And therefore, the mandate given to those African ambassadors is given by respective governments. And of course, our government, the South African government, in addition to the money it gives us, it will also mandate us to advocate the African continent interest. But that one is something we channel through the African Union. Therefore, it is difficult to say there can be a uniform approach of how ambassadors can benefit their countries from their interaction with the African Union. Let me give you one example and keep quiet. In our case, our government identified a number of priorities, a number of challenges. Poverty eradication, development of skills, industrialization, and agricultural modernization. Those are some. Wherever the South African ambassadors go, they are looking for opportunities of how to reinforce, to address those back home. That may not be the priority of another country. Let's say, for example, Nigeria. Maybe may not be the priority. Therefore, the Nigerian ambassador will pursue what his country has mandated him or her in its engagement with China. Thank you, Chef.
Right, I think I would like to pose just one simple question to both the presenters here, the ambassador and the chairman. In terms of, we are in 2018 today. 20 years from now, 2038, we should be celebrating 40 years of South Africa-China relations. I mean, we shall be celebrating, those of us who will be still alive. I hope many of us will still be alive. But I do appreciate that some of us might not be here. I intend to be here. But looking in your crystal ball, what do you see the relations being in 2038, Ambassador and Chairman, on the cultural, political, diplomatic, and economic fronts? Shall we still be lamenting our weaknesses as South Africa, or shall we say we've achieved in terms of this particularity? So 20 years from now, starting with the ambassador, I know this is a kind of an ambush, but...
No, it's a good one. It's a good question, Chair, because it's futuristic oriented. No, I think in 20 years from now, we as South African government are very optimistic that our relations would have matured and they would have addressed some of the challenges we have through this relationship. Just to give you one example, the Chinese at one point had a similar challenge with us, the challenge of poverty. There was a large number of Chinese on the side of poverty, large number. Now the Chinese are telling us that in 2020, they are optimistic that they would have addressed the issue of poverty in China. What that has to do with us, we are very keen to learn from the Chinese how they have done it and work with the Chinese to address our own problems, similar along those lines. And also we're very optimistic that the industrialization project that we're working on with China in terms of industrializing our country will bear fruit in 20 years to come. The long and short is we are very optimistic that in 20 years we won't be lamenting when we speak about either China-South Africa relations or for that matter Africa-China relations. We think FOCAC is going to also make a huge contribution. I'll just give you a simple example on this. Anyone who travels to, say, Tanzania, Kenya, Ethiopia, looking at the contribution of the Chinese in the development of those countries, the projects that the Chinese are involved with in those countries is immense. It's immense, very immense projects like that involving. In 20 years time to come, we're looking at the future. Thank you very much. And also with more understanding of the Chinese side. You know, with the Western world, because we've been socialized by that world from birth, we are more comfortable when we interact with it. And in our view, we foresee a situation that come 20 years will be more comfortable interacting with the Chinese. Very, very comfortable. Because we would have had deeper understanding of each other. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. So, in 20 years, what I would hope, or would like to see anyway, is that this idea of better understanding between two countries, between our two communities, is much better. I wish that more Chinese would be able to speak local African languages. I wish that more Africans would speak Chinese languages. I wish that when I walk down the street, I would be welcomed in and not looked on as like a stranger or alien from a different planet. So there's those things I really wish that we'll be integrated further into. I wish, and I do view that if we're on the right trajectory with this new South Africa, and where China is actually going to be coming, or where it's going, and becoming more service-orientated. Actually, if we look at the balance of payments, we will see that China will be importing far more manufactured goods and products made in Africa or made in South Africa in the next few years, because it is definitely a possibility. South Africa has a wonderful potential ahead of it. I think we mustn't be complacent. When we have partnerships, it's like rowing a boat. You can't just have one person just rowing and just one sitting back. I wish we all work together, because really we are moving in the same direction but at different phases. But I think it is really positive for South Africa. And I really just hope that in 20 years' time I won't be asked if I eat dogs. Thank you.
Okay, thanks very much. I think with that, we come to the end of our inaugural South Africa-China dialogues. Next one will be led by China Daily. And I think Rochelle is here. Maybe you can raise your hand there. Rochelle is the people. I just stand up because some people seem not to be seeing. The China Daily team, maybe you can rise. Right. There they are. They are our partners in this. I clap for them. These dialogues have been configured in such a way that they will happen at Wits and in another location. So China Daily will take charge of the next one and will invite us perhaps to a very spunky 5-star hotel where we'll have the next dialogue. That will be communicated. In the meantime, as Chairman mentioned, this is a weekend of Chinese festivities. I've always been amazed by the fireworks in New Chinatown. I intend to be there. I hope you'll be there too as well to see the very sparkling and nice, fantastic display of Chinese culture. Thanks, and lunch is ready. Welcome.